Hi.
Hi, this is Steve Resnik, and this is Game Changers with Vicki Abelson.
It is, and you did that wonderful, Steve. All right, and the dogs have decided that now would be a really good time to talk to them. We're having a day, we are in, what do you call this, Steve?
I call this an 18-room West Coast rock and roll museum.
If we have to fight with the dogs the whole show...
I can go shut them up and be back in 5 seconds. If
okay,
you
go
want me
ahead.
to.
Go shut up the dogs.
I'll be right back.
We're going to let Steve shut up the dogs. And Pete, come on. In the meantime, come talk. This is Pete George, the rock and roll comedian. Look it.
And what's crazy is my uncle was in this house from Cleveland many, many years ago when he was a rep for A&M Records. And it's crazy because he remembered all this stuff, the records in the basement and everything. So
this place is insane.
Yeah.
But what we found out is, we've got screaming dogs. We have internet that goes in and out. We have internet that doesn't work at all downstairs, which is where all the records are and the CDs. Okay.
But as they say, that's rock and roll.
That's rock and roll, and it's showbiz. And thanks, Pete. Well, we're going to talk more to Pete George. Thank you so much for doing this. So this is like we're on the fly.
Let me first say that the dogs have been punished.
No!
Today,
it's their birthday!
Today's their second birthday. There's 3 little cute Pomeranians that weigh 3 pounds. They haven't barked for the entire 2 hours we've been talking, and now we start the show, and they're very disappointed they're not in the show, because there's been a lot of shows, there's been a lot of music with dogs' names in it. You know, Walking My Cat Named Dog, and, Doing the Dog.
Just a walk
they think, why shouldn't we be here? But they're...
We've actually, Pete and I have done shows where we've had dogs. Christina and I did a couple shows where we had dogs that were featured, but unfortunately, it's very difficult to have conversation when dogs are running around because they're too cute.
We've had babies.
We've had babies.
Interesting.
Burt Young, we had his grandchild, grandson.
How cool is that?
So I was just saying. So we've had some challenges. We were going to shoot this downstairs.
We can always do a part 2.
So we can. Well,
that's great.
When we get a line down there one day.
Okay, so what we figured we would do is, we're going to save the Beat the Clock, which Steve doesn't want me to call it that, but we're going to save... Steve can find pretty much any 45 in his collection now.
It's called Stump Steve.
Oh, I like that even better. I didn't know it's called Stump Steve. That's even better. Much better than Beat the Clock. So tell people what you're able to... Tell people about the collection of 45s that you have downstairs.
Okay. I was lucky enough to find a home that has underground basements, and that's very rare in Southern California because you can't have earthquakes, because you know why? Earthquakes. But I'm lucky enough to have, I'm the 3rd owner of this house. The first owner was a contractor, and he illegally built the 3 40-foot underground basements. He made them all legal later on, so now it's fine. It's all legal.
Uh-huh.
But when I found this house, I knew this was the house to have, because we're talking about 45s that are made out of vinyl, that could melt, and it gets to be 105. Whatever it is in Los Angeles, the San Fernando Valley is 10 degrees more, and out here it's 5 more degrees. So when you talk about a day of 90 in LA, it's 105 here, but underground it's never more than 68, and the records are just fine, and they have been for many years. Yeah.
Wow.
Because the underground has no windows.
Right.
So it's like a little cave.
It is a little cave.
And we'll show it to you in part 2 next time. But it's
well, I think what we're gonna try and do. The goal is that we're gonna sit and chat with Steve now, and at the end of the show, we're gonna cross everything, and then we're gonna try going downstairs to show you the library. And then we'll also show you the 45 room, and we'll see if we're able to do Stump Steve. And you have every 45 from 1955 to the present that has ever charted. Is that correct?
Correct.
How many 45s is that approximately?
Let me do it this way.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a 250,000 songs here in the house, but there's been about 38,000 songs that have charted in Billboard.
Okay.
But you're talking about the 45 singles, they have a B-side.
Right.
And then later on, the CDs usually have 4 cuts on it.
Oh.
Now, 3 of them may not have charted, but you're talking about how much music there is. But there's been 38,000 songs that have charted in Billboard since November 17th of 1955.
Wow. When
Billboard created the first Top 100.
So that collection is the same age as I am. It's 19 days younger than I am.
Well, that's interesting. The collection's actually a little older though, because the 45 RPM single, which most of you know what the 45 is, but for those of you who don't, it's the little one, the little vinyl with the big hole. And those were singles that kids bought from the early days of rock and roll in the mid-50s all the way to when CDs were created in the early 80s and really all the way up to 88 or 89.
Wait, between CDs and Vine and the 45s, we had cassettes.
We had cassette singles for a while.
We had
cassettes and cassette singles for a while. But the vinyl didn't go away until CDs came
You know,
about.
you're right. We didn't really have singles on cassettes. I didn't buy any singles on cassettes. You're
Very
right.
few people did.
Yeah, you're right.
But Tower Records carried them for a short period of time. They tried it. It was another one of those things that didn't work.
I didn't even know they had CD singles, actually.
They had CD singles as well.
Were they successful?
They were a little more successful than the cassette single, but it never caught on big time.
Right, right. So when did 45s kind of lose their steam?
They lost their steam almost the same time as AM radio went out and FM came in. AM radio lost out in the late 70s.
Right.
Singles, 45s and vinyl lost out between 82 and 89, give or take, because there was a transition where people were still buying vinyl because they didn't know what CDs yet were.
Right.
CDs came into fruition around 82. I got the first CD I ever got was a Bobby Darin Greatest Hits CD. I listened to it and couldn't believe it, how cool it was to have a CD.
Right.
You know, even though many of my friends many of my friends said, "Oh God, this is horrible," but
right.
Vinyl's not going to go away, is it? But I liked both. I liked CDs when they came in. I liked still having the vinyl. So there were CD albums, greatest hits albums and regular albums, regular 82, 83, 84, 85, until about the late 80s when CDs really took over and vinyl disappeared.
Right.
And
although it's making a comeback now.
It's making a comeback and it never went away completely because of two words. You know what those two words would be?
Say.
Jukeboxes.
Jukebox.
There's still, give or
Are
take,
there
5
still...
million
no.
vinyl jukeboxes.
Is that
and so they still make 45s for the jukeboxes, but you can't get them for every record.
There are 5 million jukeboxes?
Well, someone told me that 5 or 6 years ago. Maybe it's less now, but
that's crazy.
Yeah.
When was the last time you saw a jukebox, Pete?
2 minutes ago.
Here.
2 of them.
Yes,
there you go.
Because
no, well, they're both vinyl. You're right. One's 78, one's at 45. But they're both vinyl.
78.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so take us back. What started this obsession with rock and with memorabilia?
Well,
I mean, this house is. Tell us some of the things that are here, and then we'll go back to why you started collecting.
Okay. Well, let's go the other way.
Okay.
Let me tell a little story, and then I'll tell you what it developed into.
Great.
Okay. I was a kid in the 50s.
Okay.
And I would sit in the back. It was me and my sister. Mm-hmm. I'd be about 8, and she'd be about 4. She was 4 years younger than me. And we used to be in the back seat of my parents' 51 Ford. Mm-hmm. And my parents, we'd go on a lot of drives, and they would play the radio.
Where did you live?
I lived in Chicago back then.
Okay. And
I'm of the Jewish religion. The reason I say that is because going back 40 years before I was born, 1910, 1915, 1920, about 80 Jewish families on the north side of Chicago bought these summer cottages way up in Michigan, in the western side of Michigan, above Benton Harbor, St. Joe, Grand Rapids, Kalamazoo, but on the lake. And they weren't rich people. Mm-hmm. They were middle class. Mm-hmm. And they bought these summer cottages. And way before I was born, all these families would, from June 20th to Labor Day, would be up there enjoying the beach.
We did it in the Catskill Mountains in
New
York.
There you go. Mm-hmm. And we had a private beach there. So I started going there when, in the 50s when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. And it was a special time because rock and roll was brand new. Mm-hmm. But all those drives we would take, I'd be in the back seat of my parents' car, listening to Tony Bennett, Eddie Fisher, Perry Como, Doris Day, Patti Page, whoever, Eddie Fisher. And I thought the music was okay, that they liked, it was all right, Vic Damone, whoever, But I never really loved hardly any of it. It was just okay.
Okay.
Then all of a sudden, rock and roll starts. And it seemed like, it may not have been, but it seemed like overnight it went from the music I just said.
Right.
To Elvis and Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis and Buddy Holly and the Everly Brothers and Roy Orbison and Fats Domino, et cetera, et cetera. Uh-huh. It seemed like it was overnight.
Okay.
And I just all of a sudden thought, how wonderful would it be to sit in the back seat of this car and hear that great, great new music by Chuck Berry, know? So once in a while, I would ask my parents, when I knew there would be a station, an AM station we'd be going when we'd be driving, I said, Mom and Dad, can you put on 1260? I know they're playing the new music, and I would just pray that it wouldn't be Little Richard or Chuck Berry because they would turn it off in a minute. I'd be praying for a Johnny Mathis, which is okay with me. You know. And they would turn it on. Sure enough, it would pretty quickly there'd be a Jerry Lee Lewis song and Fats Domino song. And
would they really turn it off?
Oh yeah, they did not like rock and roll, and they didn't forbid me to listen to it, but they would rather have that I didn't. Okay, I loved this new sound of music. I just thought it was the greatest thing ever, and it was disappointing back then because Chicago had they had one top 40 station, but it was a daytimer. And for anybody who doesn't know what a daytimer radio station is, there's not too many of them anymore, but there's still a few. They were on the dial, but they interfered with another station also on that same dial. One of them had to go off at night. So this station in Chicago, WJJD, it was called protecting. They had to protect a station also on the same 1260 in Salt Lake City, believe it or not, that far away.
Wow.
They'd interfere at night. Because for anybody who listens to AM radio, which we don't listen to as much anymore as we used to, AM radio in the daytime just covers a city, covers a market. But at nighttime it goes big, long distances.
Wow, I never knew that. And by the way, while we're talking about Chicago, our great friend and sponsor, Rick Smokey from Quick Impressions in Chicago, Addison, Illinois, right outside of Chicago, is watching. I saw, hey, Rick. And if you ever need anything printed or anything for your ramp, which we're going to talk about, Rick's your man. And for any of you out there who need anything printed, Rick Smokey, Quick Impressions in Chicago, you tell them that I sent you. They can take good care of you anyway. You don't need me, but they'll take better care of you. And also I have to give a shout out to my hairdresser, Nicole Venables of the Ruby Begonia Salon. I don't have my props with me today, but she's the best. She's in Studio City, and she's got great products. She's got fuck off hairspray. How could you not love that?
Exactly.
So anyway, so
now,
you're around for like the birth of rock and roll, basically.
I was.
Yeah.
And I didn't think it was going to last very long. Because there were priests and rabbis and reverends on the newscasts at night on NBC and CBS and ABC telling the world, adults, do not worry. This thing called rock and roll is going to be gone soon. We're going to make sure it goes away. It's bad for your children, and we'll make it go away. My dad was almost a rabbi. He was
almost a rabbi.
He was schooled to be a rabbi, but World War II came along. He went to the Navy for 4 years, fighting the war. And when he came back, he just changed his mind. He was still religious, but he didn't want to be a rabbi anymore. Okay, and it helped me out because he went to a company and worked there in Chicago for 15 years called Revere Camera Company, where they made reel-to-reel tape recorders, which he'd bring home every weekend. And so I would tape the Dick Clark Show and different ways of listening to music, or I'd just put my microphone to the radio and tape songs, because again, rock and roll was brand new and I just loved it. So it was good that he worked it there at the station. But so I was very concerned as a 9-year-old kid that rock and roll was not going to be around long.
Okay.
And then to make it worse, my parents made me take piano lessons. I didn't want to do that.
But you could have been Jerry Lee Lewis.
I know, but for some reason, as much as I loved rock and roll, I never had any intention of playing music. I just liked knowing about it, listening to it, collecting it.
Okay, let's stop for a second. What did you want to be when you grew up then? Did you want to be in music?
I never really thought I knew anybody that would help me get into music, so I never really thought that I really could, and had no clue what I could ever do when I grew up.
So you didn't have a dream?
I didn't want to be a policeman, lawyer, fireman.
You had no goal?
No goal.
No goal. Okay.
And I was a very poor student. I barely made it from one year to the next. I was a C- student.
Okay.
I hated to study. I just wanted to, all I cared about was music and sports. I played a lot of sports, but I just never thought I was the only sport I was good at. I played a lot of sports. I was pretty good in football. I played semi-pro.
Wow.
But I'm only 5'9", and I'm not sure I ever could have played pro football. So that probably would have been out of the question. But there was a possibility I could have played football, but nevertheless, I didn't know what I wanted to do. Okay, so my parents made me take piano lessons. And I had to go across the alley behind our house in Chicago, and Lionel was giving me piano lessons. So the first thing he does, I'm 9 years old, he says, Steve, I'm going to teach you an octave. There's 8 notes and 4 bars. And these 8 notes, every song there's ever been, and every song there will ever be, will be created from these 8 notes.
Love that.
Now, I'm thinking in the back of my mind for days and days and days, and going to sleep at night scared to death that rock and roll is going to go away. For one reason, the rabbis and the priests and the reverends. Now I look at him, I got a second reason. I look at Lionel and I say, Lionel, every song there's ever been and every song there'll ever be? He says, yeah. And there's only 8 notes? Aren't they going to run out of possibilities pretty soon? Another reason why rock and roll is not going to last very long. So I was very nervous about that.
All right. Nervous kid.
Yeah.
Into rock and roll.
Okay, so I was the kid in school who knew more about music than anybody else, and then I would tell the kids what radio station to listen to and all that.
Okay, wait. What's the first record you buy? What's the first 45 you buy, or 70? What did you buy first?
45s.
45s.
The first one I think I ever bought was 16 Tons by Tennessee Ernie Ford.
16 tons. Okay.
But the worst thing was that about a year later, there were 2 instrumentals. One was Lisbon Antigua by Nelson Riddle.
Okay.
Frank Sinatra's guy.
Uh-huh. You calling that rock and roll?
No.
No, okay.
But for some reason, I don't know why, I loved rock and roll and I didn't like that. But for some reason, I just love these 2 songs. I guess I bought them. I don't remember why I would have done it. And the other one was Poor People of Paris.
I don't know.
One was Nelson Riddle and one was another famous guy you'd know. Okay. And why I didn't buy rock and roll, I don't know. So they were both instrumentals. Mm-hmm. And my cousin, who was a year older, who loved to tease me, came to our house that night for dinner, and he says, "Oh, your mom," his aunt, "your mom says you bought 2 records today. What'd you buy?" And I told him. He said, "Well, I bought a record today too." And I said, "What'd you buy?" He said, I bought Keep a Knockin' by Little Richard. And he says, "How much did you pay for your singles?" I said, 96 cents plus 4 cents tax for each one. He said, "So did I, and I got music on mine." I'm sorry. I said it wrong. So did I, and I got singing on mine.
I got singing on mine.
He says, "You paid the same as me, and all you got was 2 musicals." We didn't know they were called instrumentals.
Right, that's
funny.
He
says, you paid the same as me, and you didn't even get singing. And I never bought an instrumental the rest of my life.
Oh.
Pretty much.
Wipeout. You didn't buy Wipeout? Come on.
Well, I might have gotten it, but I didn't buy it.
Okay.
I stole it. But anyway, so that was the early days. I was worried that rock and roll was going to go away. Now, my same cousin moves to Kalamazoo, Michigan.
Okay.
He's my best friend all my life. Mm-hmm. Best man at my wedding.
Okay.
We go to Michigan. He comes from Kalamazoo. Uh-huh. He's one of the 70 families.
Okay.
But he comes from Kalamazoo. I come from Chicago. But most of the families came from Chicago.
Uh-huh.
And those times were the best times of my life. It was like Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and those guys.
Uh-huh.
Every day we'd get up when we felt like it. We'd walk through the little forests around Michigan. Mm-hmm. We would see friends of ours. Then we would go to the beach at noon till 5. We had our own private beach, which was more beautiful than the beaches of Cancun, Hawaii.
Wow.
They're just unbelievable.
I'm having a hard time with this. The most beautiful beaches
the reason
are in Chicago, outside of... I see
these shows on the Travel Channel where they have the 10 greatest beaches.
Right.
And they're gorgeous in Cancun and places like that,
right.
In Acapulco. But when you walk into the water and turn around, what do you see? High rises and freeways or roads going around the islands. When we go down to our beach in Michigan and we turn around, it's the most gorgeous trees all the way to Chicago. Mm-hmm. There's no high rises, there's no roads, no parking lots. Mm-hmm. It's just beautiful sand dune beaches, and the water is just unbelievable. You go up to your waist and it's over your head, and then you swim out and you get to the next sandbar, and you're back up at your waist again. You can go out like 2 blocks, and and the water's clean and beautiful. Anyway, that's my great memories. But the memories were better at night, because at night, what I was saying about AM radio, and back then everything was on AM radio. Mm-hmm. At night, the radio stations all over the country would go long distances. Mm-hmm. In the daytime, you couldn't get anything. Once in a while, we got a signal from Chicago, but that was it. We couldn't get Detroit, Indy. But at night, we got Milwaukee, Kansas City, Buffalo, Cleveland, Cincinnati, all these stations, and all the stations in between, like Canton and Grand Rapids and Flint. We would just turn the dial 1 notch, and we picked up stations after station after station. We just wanted to hear rock and roll. And back then, there were very few rock and roll stations in the cities we lived in. Right. But if you picked up all these different markets, you could pick up all these stations. And we just wanted to hear new records. Right. By Johnny Tillotson, by Brian Hyland, by
You're before
Del
my
Shannon.
time. You're before my time. I know Del Shannon, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Whoever they were, the Everly Brothers, we wanted to hear the new music. Right. And one night, I don't know if you remember the song, it was the 3rd record I ever bought, was by the Del Vikings. They were the first black and white mixed rock and roll group. They were from Canada. And they had a song called Whispering Bell. They had a song called Come Go With Me. And I can't sing, but if I could, you would know it. Dum doobie, come and go with me. It was played
that song,
in many movies.
Yep.
And it was on the Mercury label, I think, or Dot label, and it went to number 4. Mm-hmm. It was a big, big record. It was only beat out by a Pat Boone record and an Elvis record and whatever. And it was a huge record. Mm-hmm. Okay. That was in the January type month of 57. Now, summer of 57, rock and roll is only a year and a quarter old. And my cousin and I are turning the dial, and we hear their follow-up. A disc jockey says, well, you love Come Go With Me? Well, you're going to love this one, Whispering Bells, their new record.
I don't know that one either.
That one you might not even know if I played for you.
Okay.
It didn't do quite as well.
Okay.
It peaked at, I think, 15 or 12 or somewhere in Billboard. Barely made it almost top 10. But it wasn't quite. And but I loved it as much as I did the Come Go With Me. So my cousin and I heard it, and we both said, "Mom, that's great. That is great." You know, a couple nights later, we hear it again for a second time. But then summer's over. It's back to school. It's Labor Day. He goes back to Kalamazoo. I go back to Chicago. 4 months later, we have a Thanksgiving dinner. Families come in. He comes in. We're sitting at the Thanksgiving dinner. He says, "By the way, Steve, 4 months ago, remember we were playing radio and we heard Whispering Bells by Del Vikings and we loved it? Did you ever hear it again?" I said, "No, I came back to Chicago and now we have 2 top 40 stations. Neither one played it. I watch Dick Clark and American Bandstand every day. He hasn't played it." He says, "Yeah, we have 2 stations in Kalamazoo now and no, they don't play it." And I swear to God, I'm embarrassed to say it, but I cried myself to sleep that night.
Oh, you thought rock and roll was dying?
No.
Oh.
No. I still was probably worried about that.
Yeah.
But no, my worry that night was, as long as I live, I will never hear that song again. And how many other great songs will I never hear because radio doesn't play them?
Wow.
Radio doesn't play. They only play 15, 18 records. In fact, then they played more than, later on it got
Your nightmare then is still the nightmare today.
Now, I used to go to the record stores every week. I didn't have enough money to buy records hardly ever, but I'd pick up the surveys from the radio stations. Back then they had paper surveys every week showing you the top 20, top 30, top 40, whatever. Every station was different. Sometimes they had a top 40, but they wouldn't play all 40.
Right.
But they'd show them all.
Right.
And I'd say, I don't know that, I don't know that one, I don't know that one, I don't. Oh, I've heard that. Oh, go that went to 3. Oh, great, whatever. Okay? But I realized in the record stores, in the early 8 or 10 years of rock and roll, they only played what they called the currents, the songs that were out. So if you bought Don't Be Cruel by Elvis, as big an artist as Elvis was, if you bought Don't Be Cruel with the other side being Hound Dog, the record would be on the air on the radio for about 12 weeks, 14 weeks, and then his next record would come out and it would be gone, and records didn't last more than 12 weeks back then anyway.
Right.
Once that record fell off the charts and fell off the radio, the record stores would order another 20 or 30 of those, but when that sold out, they wouldn't keep buying them once people didn't request them anymore. And a year later, you could not buy that record. The record stores no longer, they weren't available. RCA did not make that available. It was about 15 years later where they started selling oldies but goodies.
Right.
For those first 15 years, if you didn't buy it when it was new, you couldn't buy it.
Wow.
And I thought as a 9-year-old, I'd never be able to buy one. I knew that the record stores didn't carry them. Well, I didn't know they would change years later, that you could buy an oldie but goodie. I didn't know.
So this is the beginning of the thinking of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame library.
Well, it was. But I didn't know that I'd ever get anywhere with it.
But you kind of manifested your dream, is what you did.
Well, I used to say to my fellow kids in school, someday when I'm old and rich, I'm going to have every song that there possibly is to collect.
Did you really say those words?
I did. And of that old and rich, I got half going on right now. I won't tell you which half. Okay. So I wanted to collect. Now, 3 years later, we moved from Chicago to California because my mom had asthma so bad they only gave her a year to live and she was only in her young 30s.
Oh, wow.
I used to wake up in the middle of the night, go to the bathroom when I was 9, 10, 11 years old, and she'd be in the kitchen trying to breathe with machines and things. It was real bad. My uncle was a doctor, and he used to come over once or twice a week, give her penicillin shots. She had it really bad. And we read an article in Life magazine about how Tahunga, California, suburb of LA, 1 mile from us right here, Tahunga, California was the 3rd best place in the world for asthmatics.
Wait, okay, I went to school in Tucson. I thought Arizona was the best place.
Well, you didn't let me finish my story.
Okay.
Tahunga was the 3rd best place.
Oh, okay.
The 1st best place was somewhere in South America, and the 2nd best place in the world was someplace just outside of Tucson, where you're from. And the 3rd best place. My dad just started working for Revere Cameron Company. They were bought by 3M, Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, out of Minneapolis, and so he thought, oh, this is great, because Revere was only Chicago, the reel-to-reel tape recorder, but Minnesota Mining was the whole world. Scotch tape, everything, and they made all the tape, everything. So he said, if I just stay here for a year, and if the new owners like me, maybe I can get transferred to L.A., you guys go without me. So I was 14, my sister was 10, and we had a little brother too, and my mom, and we moved to Tahunga, California. My mom went from 3 attacks a week into the first year, 1 tiny little attack.
Wow.
She was fantastic.
Wow.
And she lived 35 more years.
Wow, wonderful.
And it prolonged her life.
Mm-hmm.
So we moved to California.
Mm-hmm.
Now back to me, not being selfish or anything, Mom, but you know, when I came here, I had no friends. I was used to having all these friends in Chicago. I came here, I didn't have any friends, and it took me a while to make friends.
Mm-hmm.
So I would come home from school every day, not having made any friends, and I'd play with my little brother, 2 years old, and get him into sports and teaching him things and playing with him and listening to the radio. Mm-hmm. My dad gave me this big Revere tape recorder, which is right downstairs. If we go down there, I'll show it to you. And it had the reel-to-reel tape recorder, but a radio inside. Mm-hmm. And I listened to these brand new radio stations here in LA, which was then KFWB and KRLA. Mm-hmm. And they had disc jockeys that were unbelievable, by B. Mitchell Reed and Wink Martindale and Bob Eubanks.
Wink Martindale, wow.
And Gary
Bob
Owens.
Eubanks, no kidding, Gary Owens.
Gary Owens.
Okay,
he might have been a year or two later, but still.
Yeah.
They had Sam Riddle. They had Charlie O'Donnell, the guy that said, "Here's Dick Clark." You know, for all those years in American Bandstand. They had Casey Kasem. They had these disc jockeys here in LA. Wolfman Jack. They were unbelievable. So much better than I was used to in the Midwest.
And they also had freedom back then, didn't they? Could they play what they wanted, or did they have to play?
They could play a little bit sometimes.
Because on FM, they could then later they could play what they wanted.
Well, adult rock radio could.
Yes.
But top 40 stations couldn't.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And these were top 40 stations.
Okay.
And they started doing playlists somewhere in the early 60s to where they couldn't play what they wanted. Some people said that the Midnight to 6 guy could play what he wanted, but the rest of the guys couldn't. But yeah, when I moved here probably in 59, 60, they probably could still. You know, I was too young to have known.
Right.
But yeah, they probably had someone told me that KFWB, they were limited, but they could play 1 an hour of one of their favorite new songs.
Wow.
So I don't know how true all that was. But KFWB and KRLA were the 2 stations here that were battling each other. And they had great disc jockeys. Bill Ballance was another guy. They had all these great disc jockeys. And which was kind of bad for me in a way, because I was starting to think, God, maybe I could be a disc jockey one day. But when I started listening to these guys, I could never be what they are. If I would have lived in Topeka and listened to the DJs, and I don't mean to make fun of Topeka, but a smaller market, Duluth or whatever, and the DJs weren't weren't Casey Kasem,
right?
Then maybe I could have made that my career move. But listening in LA, I could never do what Wink Martindale did. These guys are too good. Now, what I really didn't want to be, I didn't want to really be a DJ. I wanted to be a program director or music director and decide what went on the radio, because that's what had been bothering me.
Okay, so now how old are you when you make this decision that that's what you want to do?
Between 10 and 14.
Between 10 and 14.
Well, I moved here at 14, and by then I knew that's what I'd love to do, but I'm sure I knew there was no chance of it ever coming to fruition. I didn't have enough confidence in myself.
Okay.
I was a poor student. And I didn't know anybody, and I'm brand new to California with no friends yet. This is not something I can ever do.
I think it's really interesting that all these decisions that you're making as a child, you have manifested them all, so far, without confidence. See, I always thought that to manifest, you really have to have a belief in yourself, right?
Right.
So you've managed to do it without believing that you can. I'm not really sure how that works, but it worked.
Yeah, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, and these guys all had a lot of confidence.
A lot of confidence.
I did not have confidence, but I knew what I liked.
Yeah, but did that? Maybe it was perseverance that you stayed true to what you were passionate about. Did you ever change your mind?
Maybe, but you know what I say it?
What?
It was right time, right place.
Well, that's good too.
Now they might play hand in hand.
Or destiny.
But maybe destiny, but I think right place, right time is what happened for me.
Okay.
Okay, so now I'm here. It's the early 60s. I'm in high school till 64. And a lot of people felt that after Buddy Holly died, we heard all the stories that rock and roll was not as strong anymore. Because for those first 4 years, rock and roll was unbelievable. With one Chuck Berry after another, with Little Richard pounding the piano, with Fats Domino and the Everly Brothers, all the one-hit wonders of that time, with Elvis being on top of the world, with Pat Boone having lots of hits. There were so many, the Platters. the Drifters, or the songs were unbelievable. You know, Freddie Cannon and Bobby Darin, and it was one after another, and you'd see him on the Dick Clark show all the time, American Bandstand and the Dick Clark Saturday Night Show, and it was a marvelous time. Elvis gets drafted in '58, and everybody thinks, oh my God, rock and roll's going downhill now. Little Richard's going into the monastery, he's finished, you know, and Jerry Lee Lewis can't have any more hits because he married his 13-year-old cousin, and everything was going south.
Yeah.
And everybody thought, oh, now, especially with Elvis going away. But Colonel Parker, who I do not believe was a great manager later on, did some very smart things in those early days. What he did with Elvis is he asked the government to prolong his entrance into the Army for 3 months. And Colonel Parker got the greatest writers, Lieber Stoller and all these great writers, and they got Elvis all these incredible, great songs. And they went into a studio, and he recorded all these songs, like 20 or 30 songs, I believe. And then he went into the Army. Every 3 months, RCA would put these records out as if Elvis was still around.
Wow.
No, and these girls forgot for a while that Elvis was gone in Germany in the Army. And I think the songs of 57, 58, and 59 might have been better than the 56 and, I said 57. The songs of 58, 59, and early 60 might have been better even, or as good as 56 and 57. There was an article in Billboard magazine, now I was too young, I didn't see it, I saw it years later. There was an article that they wrote in 57 saying, last year in 1956, something happened in Billboard's charts that will never, ever, ever happen again.
Okay.
Out of 52 weeks, Elvis held the number one position for 26 of those weeks. Half of those weeks. Now, it was different songs. 1 week, one song for 5 weeks.
Right.
Then he'd be gone, another song for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, whatever. Out of 52 weeks, he was the number one slot.
Wow. For
26 weeks. Something that will never, ever be done again. In 1957, out of 52 weeks, Elvis was number one in, you guessed it, 26 of those weeks. He did it again. And he did something similar to it in 58 and 59 when he was gone. Might not have been 26, but it was, you know, the songs were unbelievable. And so rock and roll was still strong. Well, now in February of 59, Buddy Holly dies. A lot of people think, oh.
The day the music died, right?
Yeah. Now, they didn't probably think, oh, the music's dying now. But a year or two or three later, some people felt, oh, my God, rock and roll is not as good anymore as it was. And as I look at, now I was just living out, that's right when I moved here. So I wasn't making any friends, and I was listening to the radio every day. And I knew that wasn't true. Because it was a time when the Beach Boys hit in 61. Phil Spector with the Ronettes and the Crystals and Darlene Love and all those artists were strong as can be.
Right.
Everly Brothers were as strong as can be. Roy Orbison had Oh Pretty Woman, and it was great.
Right.
You know. And I could go on and on with the Freddie Cannons and all the incredible artists. That, you know, Dion was unbelievable during that time with 15 or 18 straight hits. You know, and it was a great time. Rock and roll was still as strong as it really was in the late 50s, in my opinion. And of course, that's an opinion. Everybody has their own opinion, but I didn't think music died at all. But a lot of people, you know, in fact, when I started hearing people talk about it, I said, yeah, music did. Wait a minute. I started thinking, no, it didn't. It didn't at all. And then, if they thought at all, and yeah, you had Louie in '63, and all these great records. And then by the end of '63, if you thought music was dying out, forget it. Because something happened called Motown, something happened called the British Invasion.
Yeah, hello, that's where I was going.
You know, from Canada you had the Guess Who, from Australia you had the Bee Gees and other groups. From the Sunset Strip it was unbelievable, with Paul Revere and the Raiders and Mamas and Papas and Steppenwolf, and you know, and then from San Francisco at Haight-Ashbury you had Jefferson Airplane, and you had Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, and 2 years later you had Creedence Clearwater. So forget it, you know.
I just want to say, I hope you all are appreciating as much as I am that not only does this man curate and own this museum of rock and roll, but he is an encyclopedia of rock and roll. I mean, what you know, what is in your brain is blowing my mind.
My cousin,
and just flowing out, right, Pete? It's crazy.
Totally. I'm
like sitting there
enamored
going, wah.
In the summers of Michigan, when we used to have those summers, and my cousin and I would have to go to the store to buy something for my parents, and our two mothers, because our dads were back off in our cities working, but the two mothers, they'd tell us a few things to buy, because we were going to the store anyway to buy some baseball cards or something. When we got to the store, we had already recited along that 4 week every record Fats Domino ever had, how big every record was, what labels they were on, when we last heard them. But when we got to the store, we couldn't. Did our mom say they wanted bread, eggs? We could not remember.
Of course.
And we didn't have cell phones. And we came home with the wrong stuff. So we remembered what we wanted to remember.
That's hysterical.
Right.
Well, but clearly this is your passion in life. This is your calling. This is what you're here for. But I mean, the fact that you can retain all of this is blowing my mind.
It amazes me sometimes, and I'm not the only one that can do it. I have a few friends that are just as good,
I don't know.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm cynical.
But let me give you the rest of the right place at the right time, because you asked that question.
Yes.
Okay, so now it's 64.
Okay.
And I graduated high school.
Mm-hmm.
I go to college only because my dad insists, because he was a great student.
Mm-hmm.
In Chicago, he typed 110 words a minute on a manual. And he got an award for being the number one typist in Chicago for speed. He taught me to type when I was young, which is great for the computer days, I was up to 70 or 80, and went to classes in high school with all girls, and I was the only guy. It was kind of fun. But I wasn't a good student, and I went to Glendale College only to please him, and failed out the first year. I didn't study. I wanted to do well, but I didn't have the interest in studies. So I failed out, and now it's Vietnam time. And I didn't realize, wait a minute, I just failed out of school, and if you're not going to school and not married with kids, you go to Vietnam.
Is this before the lottery? This is before the lottery?
Before the lottery, a couple years before. And it was actually a year or two before Vietnam got really heavy. This was 64, well, my college days were 65 and 66, so now it was starting.
Right.
All right. So I get drafted after I failed out of college. And they sent me down to the draft board. And I showed them these medical records that my parents gave me to give them when I was 10 or 11 years old. And then when I was 14 and moved to California, I used to get these little spastic colons, they think it was. Not sure, but once every 3 or 4 months, I'd wake up in the middle of the night screaming and yelling. Something in my stomach was pulling and pulling and pulling. And they sent me to doctors, and they couldn't find anything. First, they thought it was ulcers, even as a young kid, but it wasn't. And they couldn't do enough testing back then, but they thought it was. I always remember them saying, you have the same thing that Eisenhower has, a spastic colon. And I'd get 6-7 times a year. Not that often, but I'd wake. My mom would put hot washcloths on my stomach, and within 10 minutes it was gone. And I'd be good for 2 more months. So it was weird, but I took a shot and gave the draft board these letters, and sure enough, they gave me a 1Y, which meant I wouldn't be drafted again for another year. I said, at first I wanted to go to service, and I wanted to serve my country, but once I started hearing what Vietnam really was all about, I kind of changed my mind. I was never a guy that would go and protest on the streets, but I realized Vietnam's probably not where I really want to go. At first, I actually, when I got drafted, I forgot to tell you the one part. I got drafted. My parents had a party for me, a going-away party. My friends had a going-away party for me. I sat with my little brother, who then was 8 or 9, and I sat with him for a couple hours and said, Bobby, there's a good chance I won't be ever coming home.
Whoa.
I wanted to prepare him for the possibility. I've already had friends that died there. And I said, I'm going to serve my country, and it's something that I need to do. And that was the night I went down there. And, this is the second time I went down there. I'm sorry, the first year they just sent me home. Second time I went down there, that's when I really told my brother, who knows what happens. And I went down there, and they didn't care about the letters anymore. And they said, you're drafted. And they gave me a piece of paper with my rifle number. You're going to Fort Ord, and you're whatever. And my stomach started acting up for the first time in months. Because I was nervous, probably.
Right, sure.
And they took me to a room, and they said, we don't care about that. You're going, okay, go to this room. And an hour later, this guy comes in, he's a physician. He's a Navy physician, and I'm going in the Army. I don't know why a Navy guy was there, but he listens, and they sent me home.
Nice.
So I served 1 day. That was my second time there.
Okay.
And they said, we're going to call you back in a year, so don't think that we're not going to call you back. And they never called me back again. But I went back to school thinking, maybe by going back to school, I'm not ready to get married, but I'll go back to school. So I started working at the General Motors assembly line in Van Nuys making cars. But I was going back to, that was a night shift, and I went to school at LA Valley College.
To do what? What was your...
I didn't know.
You didn't know.
Just to go to school.
Okay.
I took a general major. They made me take a speech class, part of my general major. And I'll never forget the teacher that changed my life. Her name was Mrs. Economides. I should go back and see if she's still around. I'd like to thank her. I take this speech class, and there's about 30 kids in the class. And it's a 20-week course. Every kid has to give a speech once a week. I give 20 speeches. At the end of the 20 weeks, she calls me into her office, and she said, I don't know if you've ever gotten A's before. You always said you weren't a great student. I said, I never got even a B before. I'm sure I never got a B except for in physical education. And she said, I'm going to give you your first A.
Aww.
Everybody loved your speeches more than anybody else. The only thing is, I would say the only downside is you've got to stop having a one-track mind. All 20 of your speeches were about music and rock and roll and Billboard magazine. Like your speeches about why Billboard did these charts, I didn't even have a clue then.
Right.
I made it up.
Right.
But the kids loved my speeches, and they thought I knew more about music. Why did Gene Pitney write these songs that weren't hits, and then he wrote these songs for other people that were hits? Like He's a Rebel for the Crystals, whatever, the Ronettes, whoever, And so, those Crystals. So then, she gave me my first day, and she said, by the way, did you know there's a college radio station here? I said, no. Yeah, there's a college radio station. It's a class. You should go. So I went there. I did the college radio station. And because half the kids came from this class I was just in, that I gave my speeches, they nominated me and made me music director. The job that I always thought I'd ever want to have someday.
I was just going to say, you already manifested your dream.
But it was college radio.
Okay.
We only went to parking lots A and B on windy days. Okay? I went to the general manager of the station. I say, okay, I'm music director. What do I do? Do I just prepare the music? No. You have to go to the record companies and the distributors and get us free records. Well, how do I do that? Just write them letters and we'll get free records. I wrote letters. Not one record came in. Within 4 weeks or so. I go back to him. I said, Dan, this is not working. He says, oh, call him. Oh, yeah, I never thought of that. So I called Reprise, and Warner Brothers, and Capitol, and MGM, and the distributors. On Pico, there were like 9 distributors who carried. Back then, there were 150 major record labels. None took my call. At the 10 weeks, halfway through, I'm getting a fail. Wasn't doing my job. And if I fail one course, I had about 7 classes, whatever I had. You fail one, you're out of school.
Wow.
That was the rule back then. So I said to myself, if I get a fail, I go to Vietnam.
Oh.
They're going to call me back next year, which they didn't do, but I...
Right.
And maybe it was because I was in school, I don't know, but they didn't call me back, but I thought they were going to. And by that time, I didn't want to... By then, I was hearing all the protest songs by all the, Bob Dylan's and everybody, and I didn't want to go to Vietnam. So I get in my car on a Friday, and I drove down to Pico, and I went to all these different distributors and knocked on the doors, and none let me in. And I finally went to one that had Mercury, Philips, and Fontana, 3 labels. And they had the Four Seasons, which was a big group, and they had a lot of newer stuff too. And I knocked on the door, and I'll never forget the guy's name. He's the second guy I have to thank. His name was Frank Borchetta. He said, kid, come on in. And he took me under his wing. He liked me. I was just a little 19-year-old punk kid with a flat top haircut, and when he heard that the other companies wouldn't let me in, he called all his friends at all these other companies and said, next Friday my friend Steve's coming, and he's got a big radio station, and you should be answering, He again, my station went, two parking lots, But,
wow.
But he opened the doors for me.
Wow. And
now his son, Scott Borchetta, is running at one time Universal Music, and now it's Big Machine, and he's the number 1 top guy at record companies in Nashville. And every time I see him, I said, "Your dad," and he almost cries knowing that his dad changed my life. Wow! And he put me on the phone with him last year in Nashville at CRS convention, and I talked to him and thanked him. It was nice that I could do that. But he opened the doors, and he and all these other guys started inviting me to these parties for the Four Seasons. And I'm going to parties for all these artists, and it was an incredible time in the music business because
I don't even have to ask him a question. He can just take us through his whole life. I love this. All right, go ahead.
Well, I can wait for a question if you want.
No. I like it.
We're really staying overnight, just so you know.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right, I'm just telling you. You have a party tonight, and we're 45 minutes in, and we haven't gotten to your career yet, which we want to hear about.
Okay.
So.
Okay. So back to Right Time, Right Place.
Okay.
So I go from I graduated at LA Valley with a 2-year degree, and I go to Cal State LA. And they'd heard about me, and they made me program director. And for anybody who's seen the movie Almost Famous,
of course,
I was that kid.
Really?
All these it wasn't like I was, and I'm not putting down any markets, but it's not like I was at a college radio station in Cheyenne, Wyoming, or in Austin, Texas. Right. I was in Los Angeles.
Right.
So when I was knocking on all these doors and starting to meet all these people, they started inviting me to all these incredible parties. And to the Troubadour every Tuesday for 5 years or 6 years. I went to the Troubadour every Tuesday to see these new acts that some people hadn't heard of yet, like Gordon Lightfoot or Carole King, or Linda Ronstadt when she broke up with Stone Ponies, or Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, with opening acts nobody ever heard of, like Steve Martin or Richard Pryor.
Wow.
and there was no security at the Troubadour, and Linda Ronstadt would play, the Troubadour was all the softer acts, okay? And it was Jackson Browne and the Eagles in the early days. And I just go knock on their door, come on in, and they were doing drugs, many of them, and I never did drugs, and it wasn't that I didn't like doing them, I just played sports and didn't care about drugs. So I'd sit there and pretend I was doing it, but I wouldn't be doing it. And I very seldom in my whole life have ever tried a few things, but I never cared about it. But I'd sit there, I'd sit with Linda Ronstadt for an hour and a half and just talk to her, or it was just a time in my life with Dion and with all these incredible Everly Brothers. I just asked them stories and just learned about them, and talked about what was it like to be on the American Bandstand in the early days, 5 years ago,
Right.
And then every Friday night, every Tuesday was the Troubadour. And every Friday was the Whiskey and Go-Go. And back then, every week was groups that you just couldn't believe, that became the Who and, from England, or Herman's Hermits, or the Young Rascals from America, or Paul Revere and the Raiders, or the Byrds and the Turtles. And one week after another, I saw Joe Cocker there, first time ever. I saw Janis Joplin there. I went backstage and didn't take pictures, but I met them all for a second or two.
Did you meet Hendrix?
I met Hendrix one time for 10 seconds, but I met him. Saw him at the Whiskey and Go-Go, and realized how great they were. I've been to over 4,000 showcases and concerts, over the years. I still go to 3 or 4 a week,
And at this time, wait, what station are you working at this time?
Cal State LA.
Okay.
Just a little college.
And you're doing all this while you're working college radio?
Yes.
Wow.
Right. All right. And so, while I'm doing that, the station KFWB here, it was actually about a year before when I was still at LA Valley College, they were getting no ratings anymore. The major disc jockeys, some of them had left. They had a few still. And KRLA was also dying out because KFWB and KRLA were getting killed by KHJ, Boss Radio. They took over the market. And I hated KHJ as a listener because KHJ didn't allow their disc jockeys to really talk. And I loved hearing Wink Martindale tell a story about why Buddy Holly did this, or why so-and-so did that, or who fell off a train track, or who, got mugged at an airport. I loved hearing those stories about the different artists and what happened to Fabian and Frankie Avalon, and they were fun stories, but KHJ didn't allow that to be done. And so I listened to their DJs, and they just played the records, and I knew they sped them up so they could say they got an extra 1.5 songs in per hour. I could tell by my ear that they weren't playing the actual speed.
No kidding.
And they would cut them out early. They faded them early.
Right.
And I just didn't like the station at all. And the afternoon guy was the real Don Steele, and I thought he was obnoxious, and I just couldn't stand the concept. And I missed my KFWB and KRLA, but knew they were dying. Well, KFWB, who had been the first top 40 station, heard about some kid in the Valley. Now we're talking like almost famous again.
Right.
Some kid in the Valley who knew more about records, and they somehow found out about me and called me up and asked if I would be an intern at KFWB. This is the late 60s. They had a room, huge room with records. You couldn't walk in the room. It was stacked up. They just threw the records in the room. And they wanted to make a library out of it. So I was an intern for 7 months, and I filed it, and I made a beautiful library for them. And then when I was just about done, the program director called me in, and Steve, I got good news and bad news. Good news is everybody from Wink Martindale to B. Mitchell Reed to whoever was there at the time think you're unbelievable. That room that you put together is untouchable. It's gorgeous. Bad news is we've been bought by Westinghouse, and we go all news a week from Monday. No more rock and roll, and all the DJs are fired, and I'm fired, and So I asked the new owners, I said, what are you going to do with all these records? And they said, well, we're going to give them to Beacon's and not pay the bill, Beacon's storage. We don't want them. Well, we got this kid. Oh my
God, a museum's being
kid
born.
did this for 8 months. He never got paid. And how about if we let him take as many as he wants? No, we don't want some kid walking out with boxes of records that'll look terrible. No. So the PD says, you know what? I'm getting fired. I don't care. If you go out and buy a briefcase that no one can see in, you can take as many as you want. And back then they were on Hollywood Boulevard on the second floor of this building, right next to Musso and Frank. And if you went down one story into this half alley, I could park there all day long. And so I made for 11 days, till they went all news, I made about 40 or 50 trips down, filled up my car till I couldn't even, I had a big Chevy Caprice. And I would drive home like this with records on my lap and a back seat and a trunk full, you know. And I would make about 4 trips a day for 11 days and took about half these records. And that was the second part of me being a big collector. The first part, actually the third part. The first part was when I did all these parties, when I moved here and started making friends and I did all these parties, they wanted to know, Steve, what record should we play? Should we play Diana Ross or should we play Martha and the Vandellas? I'll take care of it. And at the end of the night, at these parties, I was finally making friends. They'd say, Steve, you did a great job. You keep the records. So the girls would give me the records they had bought.
Wow.
That was the first part of my collecting.
Uh-huh.
You know, you could say my buying 12 records in my first 5 years was it, but I didn't have any records, so that didn't count.
Uh-huh.
So I started collecting that way.
Mm-hmm.
Then, when I started going to all these record companies, and I was filling up the car with records every Friday and going to all these record companies, and that was the second part of it. Then the third part of it was KFWB, bringing home much of their collection. Now I had a pretty good collection. Mm-hmm. And then, 2 years later, and again, now I'm really thinking, maybe I can be a music director somewhere, even though I knew you sort of had to be a DJ first to work your way up.
Is that true?
Pretty much true. Mm-hmm. Most every program director, music director, not all, but most, worked their way up from being a DJ. Mm-hmm. And so I practiced on these 2 stations trying to be a DJ, but I knew I was not going to ever be a great DJ, but maybe I could be good enough. Mm-hmm. And if I had to go start in Scranton, Pennsylvania, I'll go start in Scranton, work my way up. And someday maybe I could be a music director or a program director. Mm-hmm. So finally, trying to think, I had something I wanted to tell you and lost my train of thought, but I'll get back to it. Okay, so I started getting invited to all these things. Mm-hmm. And then I'm at the Troubadour every Tuesday seeing Neil Diamond, brand new artist, all these, it was incredible. And so all of a sudden a guy from KRLA, a program director, comes over to me, and I'd met him once. He says, Steve, you go to everything. You're at the Whiskey, you're here. Every time I come anywhere, I see you. I'm starting a company, and we're going to start this thing. It's brand new. It's called syndication. And we're going to interview Glenn Campbell, and we're going to put a tape together for 5 minutes and sell them to radio stations so they can play a little bit of things, news about Glenn Campbell. And since you go to everything, do you have a tape recorder? I said, yeah, I got this big Revere camera tape recorder. It's 40 pounds, but if you take it to all these places you get invited to and interview all these artists, you'll be our interview guy.
Wow.
And we'll put these shows together. This was about 69. Mm-hmm. And so, since I knew everybody at Motown and knew everybody at all Capitol and Warner Brothers, I said, you got anybody to interview? I'll interview them. So, within the next half a year, I interviewed Lou Rawls, me and the original 5 Temptations in a room for about a half an hour, somewhere an hour. Mm-hmm. Stevie Wonder when he was 17, I was 19. Dion at the Troubadour. Linda Ronstadt.
So you are almost famous. That is your life.
Yeah, I was that kid. Mm-hmm. I really was. I was everywhere and going to these parties.
You were Cameron Crowe. Did he really do? He did, right?
I didn't know him.
Right, but
till later.
Okay.
So I don't know if he was
doing
the same things I was doing,
mm-hmm.
but probably was. Mm-hmm. You know, did he do more of it or less of it? I don't know. Yeah. But I was there. Mm-hmm. I interviewed Smokey and the original 3 Miracles, just me and them in the room, and I did about 35 to 40 interviews. Martha and the Vandellas, Bill Medley, Jackie DeShannon.
Anybody exceptionally nice and anybody not nice?
It's funny you say that. That was the next thing I was going to tell you.
Okay.
Most everybody was unbelievable to me. Mm-hmm. Bill Medley, for example, I didn't know him. Mm-hmm. He was playing the West Side Room at the Hyatt in West LA.
Okay.
And I got the interview. Mm-hmm. I was supposed to see him after his show. Mm-hmm. It was his first show he ever did without the Righteous Brothers, without Bobby Hatfield. Mm-hmm. His first on his own. And I got to be at the show for free and watch him, and it was a great show. He was terrific. And afterwards, I met him backstage, and I said, hey, I'm Steve Resnik. I'm here to do the interview. He says, Steve, I knew you were coming tonight, and I didn't know how to reach you. I feel so bad, but tonight's my birthday. And I got a suite up at the hotel on the 19th floor, and I got my new girlfriend here who he married. And he wrote a song called Brown Eyed Woman, which he played for her. She's black. Mm-hmm. And he played the song Brown Eyed Woman that night, the first time he played it.
Wow.
And he's so nice to me. Mm-hmm. And he says, I can't thank you enough for coming, and I hope you enjoyed the show, but I feel bad. I was partying. I got 30 people coming to my hotel suite, and I really can't, do an interview. Uh-huh. But you're invited. And I a guy friend with me. I didn't have a date, but we went up to the hotel. He said, but come up to my party. Be part of the party. Went to the party, and And about halfway through, he comes over to me. He hadn't talked again to him at all. He comes over and says, Steve, I feel so bad. The suite has a bedroom part of the suite next to it. Why don't we sneak over there for 20 minutes and do an interview?
Are you sure Cameron Crowe didn't take your life and make Almost Famous?
I know.
I don't know. This is sounding
I got no credit for that.
This is sounding really familiar to me.
So I say to Bill Medley, I said, Bill, I'm having a great time. Don't worry, we'll do it in a week or two. He said, no, we can do it anytime. He said, no, you came all this way, and you came from Glendale. I know you live in Glendale. He said, let's go next door and do it. I said, okay. And I did the interview with him. But to answer your question, he put his arm around me after he says, Steve, I do these interviews and people ask me my favorite color. You ask great questions. I really, it's a young kid, but you really, of course he was like 23, 24.
Right.
And he says, but you don't ask silly, stupid questions. How come? I said, I watched Dick Clark all my life. And by the way, when I was when I was watching American Bandstand every day when I was 9 or 10 or 11, one day I ran into the kitchen because my mom was making cookies. And I said, Mom, can I have a cookie? I got to go back to the TV because, Brian Highland's going to be on, whatever. She says, why don't you go out and play? Why do you watch American Bandstand every day, I said, Mom, let me just tell you something. Dick Clark and Elvis Presley. If I ever meet them, I may as well just die and go to heaven. There'll be no reason for me to go on in life. That's my goal. And I got to be great friends with Dick Clark. Aww. And he's been here to the museum many times. Aww. And I was supposed to meet Elvis twice, but it didn't quite work out. But that's another story we'll tell another time. But anyway, so people like Bill Medley and Jackie DeShannon and so many of the artists, to answer your question, said, Steve, you really do a great interview. And I did about 30 of them. But then one day, things didn't go so well. I had been calling Atlantic Records, and I did an interview with Solomon Burke, the great old R&B like B.B. King kind of guy. I did an interview with somebody else on Atlantic, I forget who it was. And they liked me a lot, and they asked me to do a few interviews. I was doing the same thing at A&M. I did Sergio Mendes, I did Julius Wechter and the Baja Marimba Band, I did a girl that almost made it, who I thought was terrific, Evie Sands. She was like a Timmy Euro kind of artist. But so I'm doing a lot for Atlantic and A&M. My contact at A&M, Bob Garcia, each time he connected me, he called me up and said, Steve, I got Dillard and Clark. Dillard from the Dillards and Clark from the Byrds. And he said, I got an interview. And I'd say, okay, but I really want to do your boss, Herb Alpert. Because he's selling more records than the Stones and the Beatles combined. He's so big. And he was.
Wow. And
he said, he's kind of shy, and I'll see if I can work it out. Okay. When Atlantic called me for somebody, like Solomon Burke or, somebody, I'd say, the girl's name was Tangi. I said, Tangi, my favorite group in the world is the Bee Gees. They've got 2 brand new hits, To Love Somebody and New York Mining Disaster. I think they're going to be big. When they come in 2 weeks, they're coming into LA, and I not only want tickets to the show if you can get them for me, but I want to interview them. Okay. So a couple weeks later, after I'd done 30 interviews, Atlantic calls and says, Steve, got an interview for you. I said, the Bee Gees? No, not the Bee Gees. They're in town, and we'll try to get them for you. But I got this new group. One of them was in the Yardbirds, and we think they're going to be big. They don't have any records out yet, and they're already starting to be big in England. We think they're going to be pretty big. They got a very funny name. You promise not to laugh when I tell you their name. And I need you to go to the hotel, the one where Belushi died.
The Chateau Marmont.
Yeah. They're in the back bungalow, same bungalow I think he died in, but it was 10 years before that.
Right.
We need you to go to Chateau Marmont to interview a brand new group. Don't laugh. I said, Tangi, I won't laugh. And she says, their name is Led Zeppelin. Never heard of them. Okay. Now, I had already done 3 or 4 or 5 other groups that were brand new I never heard of. I still did just fine. I knew what to ask.
Right, of course.
Okay? And I can share with them rock and roll, like, So I get there, and this was not after a concert. It was not after, they were just there for a public relations thing. And so I had no idea what to expect, except I'll do another interview. And I knew one of them was in the Yardbirds, and and so that I knew the Yardbirds songs and all that. So I meet all the guys, and when I started, I said, "Hi, this is Steve Resnik, and today I'm with Led Zeppelin." And so, John Bonham, where are you guys from? You come here to interview us, and you don't know where we're from? I'm sorry. Let me start again. I'm so sorry. I knew they were from England, but I didn't,
Right.
I pushed the button. I started again. Hi, this is Steve Resnik, and I'd always say my radio station at Cal State LA, even though I was really doing it for the other TV show, radio show, syndication show. Hi, this is Steve Resnik. I'm here with KBLA, and today I'm with Led Zeppelin. And so let me go to you, and I went to one of the other guys, and I said, how many guys in the group? And as soon as I did that, I knew I was in trouble. It was another question they would want, you know.
Right.
There were questions I asked all the other new artists.
Right.
I did the same thing with Creedence Clearwater, and they were wonderful.
Right.
Okay. But they didn't like it. And they were going back and forth to the bathroom, which I didn't realize till about 5 years later. Wait a minute.
They were doing drugs.
Wait a minute. Now I know why. They were probably up all night.
Right.
It was 12 noon. They probably didn't want to be doing an interview with some little college radio guy.
Right.
And they took it out on me.
Uh-huh.
Now, after about 10 minutes, they said, hey, we're so sorry. Stop the tape record. Start it again. We'll be nice to you. And they were.
Oh.
So it was okay.
Nice.
But I thought it was all going to go back to Tangy and Atlantic Records. And I thought I'd be blackballed from the industry. And so for the next 3 days, I told my mom, I was still living at home, Mom, if any record company calls, I'm not here. Because I know they're going to say, you really effed up. Not knowing that nobody would care. All Atlantic wanted to do, all these record companies wanted to do was tell the manager, yeah, we had another interview with your group Led Zeppelin. That's all they wanted to do. They couldn't have cared less if it got played on the radio, anything.
Right.
All right. So 3 days later, my mom forgets, Steve, it's Bob Garcia from A&M. Geez, Mom, I told you, he's going to, you know, he's a tough guy. He's going to really give me a hard time. So I picked it up thinking he's going to give me a hard time. So I wanted to get him off track. So I said, Herb Alpert, right? He wants to do the interview? No, Herb's still kind of shy. Doesn't want to do it. But I've got an artist I want you to do. So he didn't know anything about the interview, of course, the bad one. And so he said, I got it. And it was funny. He said, it's a guy from England. Doesn't have a record out. We think he's going to be big, and he's got a funny name. It was the same story that Atlantic told me. I said, well, what's his name? He said, Joe Cocker. Okay. All right. So 3 days later, I go to A&M to interview him. I wasn't going to make the same mistake. So I Googled him. Okay, maybe in 1970, maybe I didn't Google him. But somehow I found out, and I'm exaggerating, but I found out his shoe size, the names of his brothers and sisters.
Hang on 1 second. Pete, we need the other one. That one's not. There you go.
Good?
Pete's putting some light on us because it's getting dark. Thank you, Pete.
Okay, we good?
Yeah.
Somehow I knew everything there was to know about Joe Cocker. I made sure I wasn't going to make the same mistake.
Okay, so now, in those days, how did you do it?
I just called all the record companies, the ones that might have. I knew people at record companies who knew about everybody.
I see.
And I would just call them. I might have called some people at radio stations and asked them what they knew, even though he wasn't on the radio yet. And again, I'm exaggerating, but I found out a lot about him. And as I gave the interview to Joe Cocker at a little office at A&M Records on La Brea, 2 or 3 record company A&M vice presidents walked by. And after the interview, they went to my connector guy, Bob Garcia, and said, who's that kid in there? Hire him immediately.
Wow.
We need guys like that here at A&M. Hire him immediately.
Wow.
And they hired me to run their college radio program. I was still at Cal State LA, but I got my classes to be on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so I worked on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and they were fine with that. And I worked there for 6 months. And after 4 months, I revived, in their opinion, a college radio program that they had that was falling apart. And they were going to dismantle it. They said, this is the last chance. We had 4 guys. They weren't doing a good job, but they liked the job I was doing. And they said, you revived it. Now, there was a kid in the mailroom. Now, you know who Alan Freed was?
Sure, of course.
Okay. Most everybody probably knows who Alan Freed, but for those of you who don't know Alan Freed, Dick Clark was the king of rock and roll on television. Alan Freed was the major disc jockey on radio out of a station in New York, I think WMCA or WMGM. And I wasn't living there on the East Coast, but he was the god. And at night, on his AM radio station, he went to 13 states. In the daytime, he was on at nighttime. Daytime, they didn't go very far, but at nighttime, everywhere. And he was the guy that came up with the name rock and roll. He was the guy that put black artists on the radio, the Moonglows and the Coasters and the Drifters, all these rock and roll groups that just didn't get a lot of airplay. He was one of the first to do that. And he was making $300,000 a year, which today would be like $7 million.
Yeah.
You know, the other jocks were getting $24,000 or $12,000 or $15,000. He was making $300,000 a year in New York. And the payola scandals a few years later, unfortunately, ended his career. But there was a kid in the mailroom, and his name was Lance Freed, Alan Freed's son. A&M is, that I worked at now, was Alpert and Moss. Herb Alpert and Jerry Moss, A&M. Jerry Moss, Herb Alpert was the talent.
Right.
Jerry Moss was the brains. He put the whole record company together. Herb was too, but Jerry was that side of it, the executive side. Before Herb and Jerry started A&M in 1962, Herb was a promotion man. Jerry was a promotion man in New York, and he was Alan Freed's closest friend. When Alan Freed supposedly died a couple years later of a broken heart from being, his career was destroyed, supposedly Jerry was holding his hand or was in the hospital room, and supposedly, I never really asked Jerry this, but the story could be a little bit different or wrong, but apparently as he was dying that night, he said to Jerry, he says, Jerry, if you and Herb start that record company, my oldest son is graduating college and he'll be fine, but Lance is just getting out of high school, and would you take care of him? Make sure he goes on the right road. And so when A&M started, he hired Lance and put him in the mailroom. And he was brand new, but he did that for 3 years, and it was time for Lance to move on. And so apparently, Jerry Moss, our boss, went to Gil Friesen, our general manager, who became president later on, and said, find a place for Lance Freed. He can't be in the mailroom any longer. Well, you know, we'll put him in the college thing, and we'll move that. Steve can't be here 5 days a week anyway. And we'll move Steve down a notch. And so it was my first demotion. After making this department good, Lance came in as my boss, who didn't know a college radio station from, you know. But Lance learned. He was a fantastic guy. And at first I resented him coming in and taking my job and me being his assistant. But we went to lunch every day, and he would tell me stories about coming home from high school, and his dad would be there with Jackie Wilson, or his dad would be there with Sam Cooke, or his dad would be there with the Beatles, or, you know. And Lance was just a fantastic guy, and we got to be great friends. But then 2 months later, summer came. They didn't need two guys doing college when most college stations weren't existing in the summer. They'd be off the air, and they laid me off. There was a guy at A&M who liked me, who went to ABC Records and offered me a job and told me I only have 30 units left at Cal State LA. He says, get out of school, and I'm giving you a great job to do rock promotion. I said, you sure I'm ready for rock promotion? I was 20 years old. You're ready for it. So he's going to hire me week by week by week by week. 3 weeks goes by, 4 weeks go by, 5 weeks go by. He keeps calling, saying, just hold on, it's going to happen real soon. 6 weeks, 7th week, he has a dinner at his house, and there's about 6, 7 people there. And one of them is the nephew of the president of the company. And I meet him. No big deal. Another week goes by, another week goes by, another week goes by. I would have been halfway through with my final classes to graduate that I dropped. And I'm waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. Finally, I'm not happy. And I go in and see this girl, Tangi, that I knew from before. And I said, is Bob in? And he goes, not Bob Garcia, not the guy from A&M. It's the guy another guy from A&M who went over to ABC. And he said, no, he's at lunch. But she didn't know that I was unhappy from not being hired. She didn't know. She just liked me. She said, go sit in his office, use his phone, you know. So I'm in there. When he walks in the office after his lunch and he saw me, tears came to his eyes. And he goes, oh my God, Steve, I knew this day would come. I knew one day you'd come and say, why didn't I hire you when I promised you? And 10 weeks have gone by. But remember that kid at my dinner 3 weeks ago? I said, yeah. He's the grandson of the president of the company, and they forced me to hire him instead of you. And I didn't know how to tell you. You waited all these weeks, and you dropped school, and I knew someday you'd come in, and I dreaded that day would come, but I didn't know how to call you and tell you. And he was crying. I mean, just little tears, you know. And so then the door, we're in this office, the door's open, but the door opens like a little more, and there's a guy behind that I can't see. And the guy says, I couldn't see him, but he says, Larry, you want to go to lunch? Larry says, I've already been, but you remember that kid I was telling you about that I couldn't because I wanted to? Yeah. And I still couldn't see him. He says, he's right here. And he comes around, meets Steve Resnik. Hi, Steve Resnik. My name is Dennis Laventhal. What's your name? Steve Resnik. You're hired. Come with me. That was my job interview. So right time, right place.
Wow.
That was my first job, and I've never had to look for a job. Every job I had ever since came to me.
Wow.
But who knows what I would have done since I didn't get that job. I'm living at home. Don't know really all that many record. Well, I knew some people already, but who knows what I would have done. And I wanted to be on the radio side. This is the record side. So from that day, I changed my mind from being a music director or program director to being a record company executive. And I worked at ABC for 7 years and was lucky enough to be there at a time with Jimmy Buffett and Jim Croce and Three Dog Night and Steppenwolf and Mamas and Papas and the beginning of Tom Petty and the beginning of Joe Walsh and two of the Fifth Dimension, Billy and Marilyn. And I'm forgetting half the groups we had. We were so big. We had the Four Tops from Motown with 2 big hits. We just had hit after hit after hit after hit. Steely Dan. And it was a fantastic career. And I brought this over here where was it? Right here.
You know, the one thing that, hi Paul, the one thing that I'm getting that...
Jim Croce and Jimmy Buffett.
I saw Jim Croce at Carnegie Hall. I saw him open for Cat Stevens. Yeah. And it was when nobody knew who Jim Croce was. Right. And he was the first singer-songwriter that I saw that told the whole story.
Absolutely.
Of every song that he did.
He would sing a song and do 15 minutes of talk.
Sing
a song and do 15 minutes.
Exactly.
And as great as the songs were, you almost looked more forward to his talking.
The stories were amazing.
Yes. So the stories about Bad Leroy Brown were true stories, you know, or You Don't Mess Around with Jim, true stories, you know. Now, remember, I'm a kid at ABC Records, and I'm meeting Three Dog Night and Mamas and Papas, who were already huge, Steppenwolf, John Kay, and all these. And I stayed away from them. I was scared to hang around with them. I thought, if I get to be friends with them, they're going to say, how come you don't get me more airplay? You know, or how come I'm not a bigger star? You know, whatever. If their careers went south.
What was your job when you were doing rock and roll promotion? I have a very good friend Bruce Tenenbaum.
I know Bruce very well.
Okay, we went to 6th grade together. I've known him forever. So, what is your job as a rock and roll promoter at a label back then? Well, what are you doing?
I wasn't quite a promoter yet.
Okay, what are you doing?
That guy that hired me, Dennis Leventhal, put me into a job where, again, we didn't have any distributor. We had independent distributors in every city. Right. So we never knew what they were doing with our record. We didn't own the distributors. Okay. We would hire Jim's distributors in Shreveport. And then we'd call them and say, Three Dog Night's on the radio in the South, and so get records in the stores. And we would hope they would do it right. Right. So they put me on the phones calling all these record stores. If one of our songs was being played in Cincinnati, I'd call all the stores in Cincinnati within a couple of days and say, do you have the Steppenwolf song in? Because it's being played there on WSAI in Cincinnati. And how many copies do you have? Is it being requested? Are we being Right. I would get a report done. I did that for 6 months, and the label liked me, and I said, I was doing college radio at A&M. Could I do college radio over and above my regular job, do both? And they let me. And then within a year, they made me a promotion guy. So to answer your question, when I became a promotion guy, at first they didn't want me to go to any markets bigger than Little Rock. 1 million was as high as I would go, because I wasn't ready for the big time yet. Right. But it was my job to call the stations, at that time in Eugene, Oregon, in small towns in Wyoming and North Dakota and Bismarck and places, and get to be friends with them and get to promote them and even go to those markets and get records played. It was my job to get the records played on the radio stations in these smaller markets. I was called. So are you doing like the payola thing? Well, payola back then was rampant. I didn't have to do that much in smaller markets because they were just happy that I would come visit. Because the major companies were not, they'd call some of the small markets, but I went there. I went to 250 cities in my first year and a half, in person. And did you schmooze that? What did you do when you get there? Usually lunch or dinner. Yeah. Very seldom was there anything else that, wasn't above board. Right. And back then there was payola, but payola was legal and illegal. What does that mean? Well, taking them to dinner or driving them to Kansas City to see an artist. That's legal. Legal. If giving them cash? Not legal. Not legal. No, right. Not even buying a Coke for them was legal, but no one paid attention. And back then... You're lighting us beautifully, Pete. I'm looking at it. You're right. It's a beautiful thing. Thank you. Do we have questions? Because... we do. We do. All right. Okay. Let's take a pause. Okay. Ask a couple questions, Pete. Okay, let's see. Oh, this is interesting. Somebody wanted to know what that thing is called that you put in the middle of a 45 with a hole in it. Do you really think I would know that was called a spindle? Is it called a spindle? The plastic insert, right? I loved those. Yeah, there were metal ones, there were plastic ones. Yeah. They were bright colors usually. Yellow, yeah, red. Let's see, did you listen to Julie London? Well, I remember Julie London pretty well, but that was more of what they, now it's called easy listening. She was middle of the road, MOR back then. And that was, again, the Eddie Fishers and Perry Comos and Doris Days that I know I bought a couple of those records, but still, I stayed away from those. But, when you had 30 rock and rollers on a chart, and then 6 or 7 middle of the road. Right. So if you had Tammy by, Tammy. What's her name? She just passed away. Debbie Reynolds. Debbie Reynolds. Yeah, Debbie Reynolds. Yeah. If you had Tammy by, you didn't mind the fact that there were 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 middle of the road records, as long as you had your 30 big rock and rollers. Right. It's okay. Back then you had a nice mix because top 40 stations would play those songs, those MRR, a couple of Johnny Mathis or Debbie Reynolds. They'd also play the rock and rolls by Buddy Holly and the Everly Brothers and all that. Then they'd also play Johnny Cash and some couple of country records, Patsy Cline, et cetera, et cetera. So listening to top 40 radio back then was way different than it is now. you'd get every kind of music.
By the way, I just want to say, this person was watching the show last week because we had a Julie London question last week also. Who has a Julie London question? Is there any more? And then we're going to go back to Steve.
What's your favorite rock group and your favorite solo artist?
Well, you might say this to yourself. I say this to people when they come over and see my museum, and you're all invited, by the way. When people come over and they're big rock and roll fans, I say to people sometimes, because that's the question I'm often asked, I say, okay, remember Tom Hanks in that movie with FedEx where he goes to that island and he's, right?
Yeah, what was that called?
Castaway?
Castaway, right.
Okay, if you were that person, and you can answer if you think about it, you can answer that question. If you were Tom Hanks on that island,
what do you take
just like
with
10
you?
camps, but they gave you a sound system and only one album, who would that artist be? Now, I know who mine would be.
Do you really?
Mm-hmm. An album I just could never get tired of. I got 4 or 5, but if I had to pick one, it would be Breakfast in America by Supertramp.
Yeah.
Wow.
I just don't get tired of that.
Yeah.
Now, you can't pick a greatest hits because that's not quite the same thing, but if you had a greatest hits, for me, it might be Bob Seger or it might be the Bee Gees.
For me, it might be Surrealistic Pillow by Jefferson Airplane.
Yep.
Or it could be, we were just talking about one of the greatest soundtracks ever, the Bee Gees, from Staying Alive, from Saturday Night Fever.
Yeah.
I mean,
right.
It just doesn't get better than that for a soundtrack,
exactly.
right?
It doesn't. That's the 34th biggest selling soundtrack of all time. It's an album of all time. Number 1 biggest soundtrack of all time.
Is it?
I think so.
Should be.
Yep.
And favorite solo artist?
Well, my favorite, of course, is Elvis by far.
Yeah.
But that's so obvious that I kind of leave him off to the side. But he changed my life when I was 9, just watching the Ed Sullivan Show. But early on, I loved Bobby Darin. Later on, I loved the Motown artists, especially Marvin Gaye, who I became a friend with and played football with later on. And he'd been here to see the museum before he passed away, so that was kind of nice. Loved Marvin Gaye. I loved Sam Cooke and Jackie Wilson.
Okay, so while we're here and talking about this, tell us some of your favorite celebrity stories. You have to tell your Stevie Wonder story because it's just a killer.
Okay.
Especially since you mentioned that you met him early on.
Okay.
Right?
Before I tell you that story, I'll tell you just that one's a few minutes long, but I'll tell you a couple of little tiny quick ones.
Okay.
In my 40 years in the music business, in my 21 years of promotion, I tell people sometimes if they ask me if I ever had any close encounters with death or whatever, I said there were 2 times when I was almost killed.
Really?
In the music business. One time was just sort of a kind of. I was a young kid just starting at ABC Records, the very first year I was in, and I was working college radio stations at my first ever convention, a college radio convention in Boston, and I was going to every fraternity. I stayed there for 2 weeks and went to every fraternity and every sorority at all the colleges. We know how many colleges there are there, and I was putting up posters for Three Dog Night and Steppenwolf and all the groups we had, John, Joe Walsh and everybody. And on my 3rd or 4th day, my boss calls me, the same guy that I told you hired me. He says, "Steve, tomorrow you're not doing any of that stuff. You're going to the Boston Sheraton and you're meeting with B.B. King, our artist, who I'd never met yet. Our artist, B.B. King, he's going to be there, and his manager, and you're going to have a limo, and you're going to take a couple of important distributor people there, and you're all going to go to a show he's going to do at a penitentiary."
Oh, at a penitentiary.
Kind of like Johnny Cash always did, penitentiaries.
Right.
B.B. King was doing some. He was doing the Walpole State Penitentiary, which was right next to the New England Stadium.
Okay.
That the Patriots were playing in. So we go down there, and I just assumed in the back of my mind that we'd be going backstage. So they grabbed B.B. King and his manager right away, and they grabbed the other 4 of us, another promotion guy and 2 sales guys, and we meet the warden at this penitentiary, which looks so, whatever the word would be when you see a penitentiary from outside, you go, "Oh my God, I don't want to go in there," scary as can be. Right. And it was only 6 months after Attica, if everybody can remember, in Attica in Buffalo, where 21 people died.
Yeah.
Right?
Al Pacino,
and 2 guards died. Yeah, two guards died and 21 people died.
Yeah.
It was only 6 months after that uprising. So now we're at this penitentiary. Well, again, I thought be backstage wouldn't be a big deal. So the warden takes the 4 of us and he walks us through all the cells, but they were empty. It was still eerie and scary, but they were empty. And then we go to a little auditorium like you'd have in high school, 800 seats, and there's 2 doors. We go in the door, and the last 3 rows were empty. Everything else was filled with what we realized later was all the inmates. I'm still assuming that we're going backstage. We're not going to be sitting with these inmates. So I'm walking down the aisle. My other 3 friends ducked into the row, and I'm by myself. And all of a sudden, all 800 guys get up, stand up, and do this to me. And I don't know what it means exactly, but it scared me to death. I turned around and realized my friends didn't follow me down. I'm halfway down. I turn around, go back and sit down, shaking and scared, And they're talking to a guy in front of them. this guy's got to be 75 years old. And I found out what they've been talking to him about. They made friends with this one guy, and his name was Eddie. I'll never forget it. And he says, I got there in time to hear him say, I just can't believe I'm in this penitentiary. All I did was rob 2 banks. Everybody else in here murdered people. Everybody. There's not one person here that didn't murder people. I'm the only person here that didn't murder someone. All right. So we're scared to death after about 3 songs, and then they send a girl out from the top 40 station then, but now it's a talk station. Forget the station, but they send a girl out to say, here's B.B. King, and she's got a mini skirt on, and she could have been a Playboy centerfold. She's gorgeous. And it's the last person you want to send out there. Because, again, all these 800 people get up there, they all have, all the cigarettes rolled up, and they're giving her this, and they didn't even hear what she had to say. They just couldn't believe she's gorgeous. Mm-hmm. The 4 of us look at each other and say, we got to get out of here. We can't, this is not going to be good, So we leave, and we find our way back to the lobby, and we waited for it to be over. Well, they have a jewelry thing. They're selling jewelry. And
in a prison?
Yeah, in the lobby, they're selling stuff that the inmates made.
Oh.
And so I didn't even look at the stuff. I'm still shaking. One of the guys says, I want to buy this. This was made by this guy right here, it says. It's also another Eddie. Mm-hmm. This was made by Eddie DeSalvo. You know who Eddie DeSalvo was?
I know that name, yes. Wait, I know he was the Boston Strangler.
Correct.
Hello!
So the guy says, I want to buy this by Eddie DeSalvo. Wow. This ring or whatever it was,
Wow.
And he says, so Eddie DeSalvo, he used to be in this prison? Used to be in this prison. He was in this room you were just in. He was probably sitting next to you.
Oh my God.
Okay, so we go back, my partner and I go back, and we go to every sorority and fraternity for about 10 days. Our last day, we're going to Logan Airport, and we're just about into the tunnel, and the radio station, WRKO, is a big top 40 station. We're listening to a song, and they did something we found out they almost never ever did ever again or before. They cut the song and said, we have a news report. There's just been an uprising at Walpole State Penitentiary. 2 guards have been grabbed. They found an arsenal of weapons, and they're holding these 2 guards. It could have been us.
Holy shit.
All right, that's my number 1. Now, they didn't kill the guards, and they got out of it, so that.
Okay.
But the second one is really more.
Yeah.
And that is that when I mentioned that I was scared, too intimidated to be friends with artists on ABC Records, there was one artist I could not, there was just no way I could not be artists with, and that was Jim Croce that we mentioned before. He just became one of my best friends.
Wow.
He came here and saw this collection. I was living in a different place then, but it was only 1 room, not 18 rooms, but he came over and saw my collection. We went to lunch every time he was in LA, and we just hit it off tremendously. One time I was in Des Moines. Every Wednesday he would call me to see what his Billboard chart numbers, because I'd get the numbers on Wednesday before the following Monday. And he always wanted to find me, hoping that his numbers were good. But we talk, and it was a friendship thing, but he also wanted to talk business. And one time I was in Des Moines, he goes, well, I'm in Fargo at Moorhead State Penitentiary. Why don't you get up here and hang out with us for dinner? You'll see my show.
Another penitentiary story.
No.
Oh.
Did I say penitentiary? I still have it in my mind.
Okay.
I'm at Moorhead University.
Okay.
I said to him. And he said, I've got a show, in 6 hours. If you can catch a flight, So I called my boss. He said it was okay. So I had to catch at 4. I drove from Des Moines to Omaha at over 90 miles an hour the whole way because I had to catch a 4 o'clock plane from Omaha. I got there. I didn't even go to the rental car place to return the car. I just left it in front of the airlines. Ran to the gate. It was 2 minutes to 4. Slow down. The plane was canceled. There was a snowstorm where they came from, and now I had to catch a 4-hopper, and I got to Bismarck for his last song, which was no big deal. And we went to dinner afterwards, and I took off the next morning. Well, about 4 months later, I'm in Mobile, Alabama at a station, WABB, and he finds me on a Wednesday. Where are you? I'm in Mobile. Yeah, your secretary gave me the number. Okay. Well, I'm in Louisiana. It's an 1.5-hour drive. Get over here right now. I called my boss. I said, is it okay to be with Jim again? He said, well, yes, but it's 4:30 our time. You got to call me in 1 hour at 5:30 before you drive over there. Called him at 5:30. Steve, you can't. We just signed 2 new artists from Crosby, Stills, and Nash. We just signed Crosby, Nash. They're going to be in Atlanta tonight, and we need a representative from the company to be there for a showcase they're doing and kind of say hi, welcome to the label. Great. Called up Jim Croce. Can't be. He said, I just kicked off. I have a 6-seater tomorrow going to Natchitoches.
Oh, I know where this story's going.
And I kicked off one of the guys, and you're going to be the 6th guy, but if you can't do it, you can't do it.
That's the plane he died on. He died on that plane. Oh, my God. Oh, my God.
So that one was closer to home. I would have been on that plane.
With Jim.
Now, maybe something would have been different. Maybe it wouldn't have crashed. I don't know. But I would have been on that plane, and
That is insane.
So
I remember that day.
Now, what was the final story you wanted me to tell now?
I wanted you to tell the Stevie Wonder story, but you said that you had a few stories you wanted to tell along the way.
Well, I'll tell one fun one.
Okay.
I like this one a lot. When I was in college radio back in 69, 70 and doing all these interviews, this girl, Tangi, that I knew at Electra, she called me one day and said, Steve,
So far, by the way, I've passed all his tests. Have you noticed that? The Eddie DeSalvo, well. I'm like really impressed with myself.
That was good. That was good.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I'll have to think of a tougher one. You're too good.
I'm like, oh my God, the pressure's on. I got to answer these questions right.
Right. Okay, so she calls me up. And she's with Electra. She's Steve. I know you like the Doors, and you went to see them at the Whiskey a few years ago, and now they're bigger than ever, and they're playing the Forum.
What year is this?
This would be 70 or 71.
Okay.
And it was 3 months before he died. So
that one needs batteries, I think. Oh, you got it.
It was 3 months before he died. So I think he died in November of 71. So it must have been summer of 71. I could be off by a year, but he was the same age everybody else was when he died.
Jimmy and Jim, yeah. He was the third one to die, yeah.
Right. Okay. So by now, Jim Morrison is one of the biggest things in the world. He's as big as the Beatles. He's huge, especially in the West Coast. You went to a party, all they did was play the Doors albums over and over. They didn't play anything else. And so I said, I met him once for a second, but now it'd be nice to meet. So I get invited to the Forum to see him.
Right.
The secretary calls back the next day. It's a week later.
Yeah.
The show's a week later. She calls the next day. See, I couldn't say anything yesterday because I didn't know if I could get an invite, but we're having a private party the night before the Forum, next Wednesday, and I got you an invite, so you can go. Great. So.
Are you a huge Doors fan?
On a 10 scale, I was an 8.
Okay.
I was still probably a bigger fan of a few other groups, but the songs of theirs that I loved.
Okay.
Okay. So I was pretty close to. I was probably a 9. Okay. So by now Jim Morrison's so big. I said, now it would be nice to do more than shake hands and get to talk to him for a little bit. So I said, Tangi, I'm there. And she said, yeah, you got to go by yourself. I can't get you +1, but I got you 4 tickets for the Forum. But for the parties, you. Okay. So I go there in my 1961 Chevy, and I get there, and she said, it's going to be at a 4-story house that Betty Davis just moved out of. Now, it's important that we remember it's a 4-story house.
Okay.
Because why?
Somebody's jumping off something.
No.
Oh.
I opened the door to the party, and it was like a Cheech and Chong movie. Smoke, marijuana smoke. I couldn't see 10 feet. And again, I'm not a marijuana smoker. And I didn't mind breathing it, and I didn't care that people did it.
Right.
But I said, I got to get somewhere else. So I see there's some stairs. I remember, 4-story. Well, there's some stairs. That's what made me think. It's a 4-story. So I start going up the stairs, and here is Jim Morrison walking down. I'm walking up. Now, nowadays, if it was President Obama or President Trump, I couldn't care less. Hi, I'm Steve Resnik, but back then I was intimidated. I didn't know what to say, what to do. I just was walking past him. And on the stairway, he stops me. Kid, who are you? I'm Steve Resnik. What are you doing here? In that tone. Oh, well, your record company, Electra, invited me. What do you do? I'm the program director of KBLA. I didn't say college station. Program director of KBLA. Oh. Do you have a car? I said, yeah, I got a car.
Oh, God.
Yeah, me too. He says, what kind of car? I said, 61 Chevy. He said, where's your car? I said, well, it's out the door and about a block and a half down on the street. I said, I'm going to be buying Jim Morrison drugs.
Oh, my God.
So he says, I got a car. Do you have keys for your car? I said, well, yeah, I got keys for my car. He said, well, then you're going to need this. And he walked away. Can you read that? How are your eyes?
I have my glasses.
Okay.
But it's dark. Wait, what does this say?
It says
Doors.
And it's got a date, which is the name of their next album.
Something 71.
Yeah.
11/26/71.
I think that was the name of his album that came out just before he died. But he gives me this.
Yeah.
And to this day, besides having his DNA in here, besides that, I have no idea whether they made 10 just for the group or they made 1,000, and I have no idea. But
he gave it to
that
you.
He gave me that and said, "You're going to need this. It's a keychain, and I have a car." So that was one of my favorites.
That is just such a sweet story.
Yeah.
That's a sweet story.
That was nice.
I wouldn't expect that from Jim Morrison.
Right.
That's a sweet story.
Yeah. So that was one of my favorites. But
so he intimidated you first, and then he gifted you.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. The other one that I wanted to just real quickly is that for those of you who will come visit one day, the collection, the museum is 18 rooms.
Steve, tell people, if they do want to come visit, how do people come visit? What do they do to get connected to you?
Well, I'm half kidding because it's not open to the public.
Right.
It's just for friends. I've had 28 record company presidents, and I've had people like Bill Medley, who I mentioned before, and Little Anthony, and Marvin Gaye, and Dick Clark, and Casey Kasem, and Art LeBeau, and all these people have been over here, 28 record company presidents, which I might have already said. And Mick Fleetwood came over twice the last couple of years, and great songwriters, and just so many. And I love sharing it with those kind of people. And I don't mind, I like sharing it with friends and other people like that, but if anybody ever wants to get a hold of you and they're coming to LA, and I don't mind if I got some time, I'll do it.
I want to do a shout out to Rob Burnett, who is the person that got me into the museum.
Yep, Rob's the best.
And Rob's
I was partners with him for a couple of years with my newsletter called Ramp.
Okay, so tell us, before you tell this story, tell just the quick version of what Ramp is.
Right. Well, remember I did record company promotion. I was at ABC for 7 years. I worked my way up to vice president there and worked with one of the greatest of all time, Charlie Miner. For anybody who might not know Charlie Miner, there's been 300 true Hollywood stories, and the first one they ever did. Everybody else was movie stars and TV stars. He was just a record company executive, but the best promotion man that ever lived.
Wow.
He was my partner at 4 record companies, and he was unfortunately murdered by a girl he dated 6 times that he broke up with 24 years ago.
Wow.
That's why the true Hollywood story. But he was the best promotion man ever, and he and I were partners in my final year at ABC Records, where we had 5 hits in 1 year. We went to United Artists, where we worked closely with Kenny Rogers and Jay Giles and Kim Carnes and Betty Davis, Eyes with Kim Carnes, and we just had a couple of years there. Robert John, Sad Eyes. And then a year later, we both went back to A&M, where I had been 10 years ago, and he had been 4 years ago, not at the same time. We didn't even know each other. We both went back to A&M as vice presidents, and we had the time of our career with Supertramp and Janet Jackson and Bryan Adams and Styx and Amy Grant and Gin Blossoms and Split Ends and on and on and on and on. We had, and that was our greatest 10 years. After that, I didn't know exactly what I was going to do because I could have gone to Giant Records with him. He went to Irving Azoff's label, but instead I went with Tom Noonan from Billboard magazine, and we started a company. And we did marketing for 2 years, which I didn't enjoy after doing promotion. And we were doing okay, but then we started doing a charts magazine because BDS and Billboard just started this new monitoring system, and we didn't feel they were doing it right, so we tried to do it our way, and it was a huge success in every way except financial. We couldn't afford...
That's the story of my life.
There you go. We couldn't afford the cost of the booklets that we had to send to every record store in America. Back then there were 20,000 record stores still in existence.
How many are now?
About 4. So we did that, but when we couldn't make any money, all of a sudden the Gavin magazine offered me a job, and they were in business for 30-some years, and they were what's called a tip sheet. There were a lot of tip sheets, and they tipped radio stations off as to what records to play and not to play. That's why they were called a tip sheet. They tipped them off.
And okay, so what was the criteria of play this, don't play that?
Well, there was lots and lots and lots of criteria.
Okay.
There was jukebox play, there was airplay, there was sales, word of mouth. All those things entered into it. You might have a record by Fabian after he had a couple of stiffs, which means they weren't hit records, but you liked him a lot. He's been to your station, he's done little showcases for you, see you play his record even though you really don't know if it's going to be a hit record.
Right.
There's lots and lots of reasons. I only gave you 4. I can give you 100 reasons why to play a record and 100 reasons not to play a record. And payola entered into that, of course, as well at the time. There's all these reasons. Program director's got 2 kids, and you buy them the kids something for Christmas. It might make the difference. Now, you go to a radio station, and he's going to add 4 records that week. He's got 30 records to add. He's got to pick 4.
Right.
If your record is a bad record, not even close, it doesn't matter if he loves me. He's not going to play my record. If I've got a record by Janet Jackson called Rhythm Nation that he knows is going to be a smash, it doesn't even matter if he likes me. He's going to play it.
Right.
It's those borderline records. Gosh, should I play that record? Maybe. It's almost.
Can you
it's
think
an
of a
almost
borderline record that you pushed over the top?
We had one that my partner I mentioned, Charlie and I, we had a record, and we didn't know whether to promote it or not, but we had nothing else really to promote. Let's go back and try that record again. We couldn't get any airplay the first time. And we worked it, and the next thing we knew, it was #1 in the nation. And went to number one only because it was a reggae record we didn't believe in. UB40, Red Red Wine.
Jesus.
If we'd have had a Police record, if we'd have had a Bryan Adams record,
you wouldn't have done it.
We wouldn't have been able to work this record. We would have had too many. But it was one of those few times we had nothing else to work, and we liked the manager a lot, and we thought, you know what, it's not going to be a hit record. You know, and there are times where we were all wrong.
Right.
You know, and there's times where I've loved records that didn't become hits. And I learned early on with Jimmy Buffett. That's how I first learned. Irving Azoff was the manager, and he was a great manager. But I was intimidated by him as well because he was already a big name with the Eagles and all kinds of groups. And so he had Jimmy Buffett. And so he asked me one time after we had a song called Come Monday, which mid-charted, peaked at 30. It was a fabulous record. But country stations would say, it's a little too pop for us. And pop stations, it's a little too country for us. It was in the middle. It should have been a hit record. We didn't bring it home. And I thought he as a manager would be mad at me. And one day I'll never forget him saying to me, he says, Steve, it doesn't matter what me as a manager thinks of my record or my artist. I mean, it does, but it sort of doesn't when it comes to having a hit record. It doesn't matter what you as an executive at a record label thinks. It doesn't matter what the A&R person who signed him and decided which record to put out. It doesn't matter what they, in long term, thinks. It doesn't matter what the radio guy thinks. All that matters is you get it played on the radio, and the listeners, they're the only ones that matter. If they decide to buy it and play it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then it's a big record. So if you don't think The Candyman by Sammy Davis Jr. is a good record, which I never did, but it sold 3 million copies, then it's a great record. There were people that laughed about Sugar Sugar being a silly, stupid bubblegum record.
I would be one of those people.
But if it sells 2 million, would you like to be the person collecting the benefits of that?
I would.
You know?
I would. That's why I have no money. No.
Oh, there you go. So it really is in the case of the listener. So if a record gets played and doesn't sell and it doesn't get played, it just wasn't a hit record.
Okay, so get back to Ramp. Because I'm looking at the time. You have a thing to go.
Okay, we'll do
we
10
have to,
more
we have to get to Ramp, and then you got to give me. You got to give me the Stevie Wonder or whatever you're holding.
I'll get the
in your
Ramp
hand.
helicopter and take me over there.
Okay, good.
Fine. Okay, so when I'm at Gavin, the Gavin magazine was not doing well. It was in its final days, and it was pretty close to going out of business. And they were trying new things. And my partner, Kevin Carter, and I were doing the Gavin, and the guy named Dave Schoen, we were doing it. But he was leaving, and so Kevin and I were doing it together. And every week in the Gavin magazine, weekly, we would do one story that he would write, and I'd sell 3 or 4 ads. And that was what we did. Well, the new owner came from England. We didn't feel he knew the American market very well, but he said, let's try something new. How about a daily fax? There was no such thing as email yet.
Right.
Let's do a daily fax of the news of the day.
What year is this?
98.
Okay.
And Kevin, the writer, my partner, still to this day, my partner, he's the best. But he looked up at this guy, David, the new manager, owner, and said, you're saying that I got to write 7 or 8 stories a day when I used to write 1 a week? You got to be kidding. And I looked at him, David, and I said, I got to sell 3, 4, 5 ads every day? Are you kidding? But back then there were 50 record companies. Today there's 9 left.
Right.
There's some small ones, there's some good ones starting up, but back then there was Casablanca, and there was Geffen, and there was all these record companies. It was a great time. And so I gave every one of these 50 companies a free ad for the first 2 weeks. And almost everybody loved it. And we hit big. And my partner being one of the great writers of all time, we hit big. And we were called Gavin Mail. Then we changed the name to Gmail, which we forgot to copyright. Or I'd be in a
whole different world now.
In a mansion in
what
Guadalajara.
You are in a mansion, but it's a different kind.
Right.
Yeah.
So we did Gmail for 4 years, but Gavin finally went out of business. And Kevin and I moved over to Radio and Records, which was the biggest tip sheet of them all. And we went over there, and they had a column in their newspaper, which used to be the first thing everybody read, but now it wasn't being read too much because email finally hit, and the news, by the time it got mailed to you, was 4 days old.
Right.
So it was called Street Talk. So we called our newsletter Street Talk Daily. And it went out. Now we transitioned from fax to email. And it became very, very successful for 7 years. And then Nielsen bought Hollywood Reporter, Billboard, and us, R&R. But 2 years later, Nielsen decided to close the doors at R&R. So my partner went off on our own. We renamed it Ramp, Radio and Music Pros. So we've been doing it under 3 names, but for 21 years.
Wow.
And
how many people subscribe?
There's about 5,000 radio stations and 2,000 VIPs.
And so Okay, so it's radio stations and VIPs that are getting this.
Right.
And what is RAM telling them in a nutshell?
It tells them the news of the day. What happened yesterday in the music business? What program directors got hired or fired? Mm-hmm. What new syndication shows there's going to be? If J-Lo got mobbed at an airport? If a radio signal fell, if the pole fell down and they were off the air for 2 days? Or if there were floods and what the radio stations did? Mm-hmm. Or the charities that they do? Mm-hmm.
So is radio still alive and well?
Yeah, yes. You might get different answers from different people, you know, but it's so different from what it was before.
I'm a Sirius listener. That's all I listen to.
Yeah, okay. You know, people thought Sirius would take more of a dent out of terrestrial radio. Mm-hmm. And I don't know all the statistics, but I think terrestrial radio is doing, Sirius is doing fine too, you know, but terrestrial radio still has a lot of listeners, and when records become hits, the majority of the time they look at the radio stations as their stepladder to, you know,
still
getting there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, that was a great explanation. Now, now tell us a good story.
Okay. In this museum that many people will see one day, and many people have seen over the years.
We're going to try, before we go off the air, we're going to try and go downstairs and do the 45 thing. Before I continue, for those of you that are listening out there, if you think of a 45 between the years 1955 and 1974 that you would like Steve to find, we're going to go downstairs, and as long as we don't lose signal, Steve will find those. People will name one between 1955 and 1974, and Steve will find it within about 25 seconds or so.
Maybe.
Oh, and maybe, and you know, this is not an exact art, but he will give it a go. So if you can think of, maybe we'll take 3 songs if anybody has any suggestions of songs you'd like Steve to find. Okay.
Right. But chances are we're not going to get a signal down there, but we'll try.
We might not get a signal down there.
Right. But anyway, in this museum of mine, if I may brag to you guys just a little bit,
you may.
There's 18 rooms, and there's about thousands and thousands of pieces of memorabilia. Some are matchbooks that aren't worth 2 cents, and some are lighters, and some are pads of paper with Whitney Houston's name on it.
What are some of the most valuable things that you have?
Well,
or the most special to you?
Yeah, some of the most special things are my Led Zeppelin inflatable that you can see up there. I've got a shirt in my eldest room that he wore a year before he died with his blood on it because he had a nosebleed.
Oh, stop.
Yeah. And my ex-wife, Mary, did the makeup. She's a makeup artist and did the makeup for Frank Sinatra on and off for the last 15 years of his life, and she saved one of the powder puffs. She did his makeup. Oh. So I try to tell people that I claim to be maybe only one of the people in the world that has both Elvis's and Frank Sinatra's DNA in my house.
And Jim Morrison.
And Jim Morrison's.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a few others, but Sinatra and Elvis.
Wow.
You know.
Wow.
So next time you come over here, you might see a little Elvis and a little Frank filing records. You know, and I clone them.
They clone.
Right.
We do not clone alone. Anyway, yeah.
But anyway, here's one of the more, to answer your question about one of my favorite things.
Okay.
As you go through and see the thousands and thousands of pieces, there's.
Tell us the 18 rooms. Give us a
every room
quick
has a
rundown.
different theme.
Okay, so give us the rundown of
what the... There's a room for Elvis, a room for the Stones, a room for the Beatles, there's a room for the 50s, one for the 60s, one for the 70s, one for the 80s, one for the 90s. There's...
Beach Boys.
Beach Boys, and Prince. Some are smaller rooms than others, one for the Monkees. It's not so much my favorite groups. It's not so much who was more famous, although that plays a little bit into it.
Right.
It's who do I have the most memorabilia.
Stuff.
You know, I got a lot of Taylor Swift stuff, so she's got an area, but it's a shelf area.
Uh-huh.
I got a lot of Adele stuff, but not enough for a room.
Okay.
You know, so it depends on how much. You know, I'd love to have a Bob Dylan room, but I don't have that much Bob Dylan memorabilia.
I see.
You know, it depends. The piano behind us is one of my special things here in this room. A good friend of mine wrote Midnight Train to Georgia on that piano.
Oh.
And it's a great story that he wrote when Lee Majors first met Farrah Fawcett. She was trying to be an actress and she couldn't make it. She was getting like one cigar commercial once every 3 months, and she wanted to go back to Texas. Yeah, the story's been out now, but
I think I heard it from you maybe.
Oh, maybe so. I told that story maybe last time. I was playing racquetball with Jim Weatherly, and he was an All-American football player. We played football together, semi-pro. And he told me the story one day after racquetball how he wrote the song for her because she... For her. It was for her, and it was called Midnight Plane to Houston. He wrote the song because she was falling in love with Lee Majors, and he was living in Encino, but she didn't like living in L.A. except for because of him. She wanted to be with him. And so the father, who was I think a doctor in Beaumont, who had enough money, said, hey, there's this brand new thing, it's called the Red Eye. And if you take them, in the Red Eye, when they first started the Red Eye in the airplanes, they were much cheaper.
Uh-huh.
And she said, if you take the Red Eye every Friday night and come back every Sunday night, come home for the weekends. And then you'll be with Leo during the week. He was doing the Big Valley with Barbara Stanwyck then. He wasn't the $6 million man yet. Mm-hmm. But she was going back and forth. And Jimmy, so Lee was driving her to the airport, LAX, the story I got. He was flying her there on Friday, driving there on Friday nights, coming home alone, picking her up on Sundays, 2 in the morning, because the midnight plane came in at 2 in the morning. Uh-huh. He'd pick her up, drive alone at midnight, pick her up, come home, and then he had to be on the set of the Big Valley at 5 in the morning, so he was getting no sleep. Finally, he told his friend Jimmy, you're going with me. So it was 3 going, 2 back, 2 going, and 3 back. He was never alone. Lee was never alone.
Right.
Jimmy got tired of doing it and wrote a song called Midnight Plane to Houston about a girl who couldn't make it in the big city. Some girl in the South, I think her name was Dorothy Moore, who had 1 hit, I'm not sure, it might have been somebody else, recorded an R&B version of that country song. It was a country song that Jimmy did on one of his albums. And you'd never believe, it was a good song, but you'd never believe it could have been a hit record, especially rhythm.
Right.
But she recorded it. It was not a hit for her, but got played a little bit in the South. A year later, Gladys Knight comes into town to do a concert. She's in a limo, hears it. Find out who that is. She calls Jim Weatherly. Can I record your song? And he says, yes, but not Midnight Plane to Houston. It's not Midnight Train to Georgia, because the first girl changed it. And she called Jimmy every day, can I record your song? Yes. Can I change it to Midnight Train to Georgia? He goes, why? Well, I'm from Georgia, and I got a lot of friends. They've never been on an airplane.
Wow.
And they've never been out of the state of Georgia. So
I love it.
So Gladys wanted to do the same thing, and it wound up being the biggest record of 1973.
Don't you love how that happens?
72.
Okay, tell us the story.
All right. So anyway, so in this museum, there's thousands and thousands of buttons and pins and backpacks and all these pieces of memorabilia, Eric Carmen telephones and things. And these were all made. Some were spent good money on, and some were 10 cents. I myself couldn't care less if it's a Brittany Houston pool thing, for the swimming pool. It's whatever it is.
Right.
I just like having things and stuff. And so you put it all together, it's pretty valuable. Many of the items have no value. They're just little tiny things. But in my Beatles room, I have something that was given to me by someone, a couple of special things. One is when they gave the Beatles the label Apple, they put together a big poster framed with about 15 different Apple possible insignias. And I got the original one they made for that meeting.
Wow.
So that's good.
That's very cool.
But then I got, what I'm told there's only about 7 of these, and that's when Yoko and John, about 9 months before he died, they put together a jewelry company. And I got one of the samples. They only made 7 or 8 samples.
What?
And I got this sample.
Oh my God.
That they did.
It's the drawing of John.
And he signed every letter. Yeah.
Wow.
So that's kind of cool.
Wow, that's very cool.
Right.
Oh my gosh.
So some things, and then there was an artist. I love this little piece. There was an artist. I don't even have my glasses on. What was it? He didn't make it too big, but what was his name? I've forgotten it now.
I can't.
Okay, check the other side. It's not there. He was on Capitol Records.
Willie DeVille.
Willie DeVille. Yeah, he did.
I have friends
he
that
did
played
okay.
with Willie.
He did okay.
That played with me DeVille.
Anyway,
yeah.
Those of you from the 50s and 60s, and those of you who watched the movies from those times, and look when the TV stars got into like James Dean and all that, and they had the switchblades, they made for Capitol Records made a switchblade for him, and so I kind of like this one because if you take a look at it, you say, you know what? If you don't be careful today, I'm gonna comb your hair. But anyway, I love all these little things. There's thousands around, everywhere you look. There's thousands. There's 1,000 T-shirts, and there's all kinds of great stuff.
There's amazing stuff here. Okay, so before we go downstairs or try to go downstairs, tell your Stevie Wonder story because it's such a lovely story.
Okay. There was a gentleman at Billboard. His name was Tom Noonan. He was a legend. I was lucky enough to work with 2 legends: Charlie Minor, who I mentioned earlier, and Tom Noonan. Tom Noonan was a kid he's passed away now. He was older. He grew up he was born in Canada, but grew up in New York, and he worked at Yankee Stadium in the 30s, and he went to college out of New York, but right after that, it was World War II, so he went into the war. But the first week he got into the service, we beat the Japanese and the Germans, and the war was over. He still spent 2 years there, but he didn't have to see any action.
Right.
The war was over. When he got out, he didn't know what to do with his life, and he started selling Zenith radios in New York. And in 1949, he went to deliver a radio to some guy, and he worked at Billboard magazine. And the guy says, I like you a lot. Do you want to work at Billboard? I need an intern. Tom, in 1949, went to work at Billboard magazine. It was the year that the 45 RPM was created and invented by RCA Records, 6 years before rock and roll. Tom worked as an intern. A couple years later, he got a full-time job. A couple years later, he was head of the charts. And it was only a top 30 back then. And it was, you know, the Dinah Shore and Frank Sinatra days. They only had a top 30. Nobody really cared too much about the charts. It wasn't a big deal. But Tom saw this thing coming called rock and roll. And he went to his bosses in the summer of 55 when he saw Chuck Berry records and Little Richard records just starting in the South. And a guy named Elvis Presley in the South who wasn't signed with RCA yet, but with Sun Records. And he saw Bill Haley with Rock Around the Clock and just a couple of records that sounded like rock and roll. And he asked his boss if he could create a top 100 instead of a top 30. And they fought him for 4 months, and on November 17th, they allowed him to come out with the very first top 100, and he decided to put 3 of them out. And there was a top 100 for sales, top 100 for, you know, I always remember 4 things, but it was just 3, so I'm not forget which one of the 3 it was. It was 3 of these 4: sales, airplay, jukebox, and sheet music.
Wow.
It was 3 of those 4, and I forget exactly.
Okay.
It was 3, but he had 3 separate top 100s.
Wow.
And he did that for 2.5 years till he realized, except for the sheet music one, they were pretty much the same. And so it was too much work. So he and a young guy, 14 years old, who started Sire Records later and found Madonna for the first time, a guy named Seymour Stein, who's a good friend of mine. He was a 14-year-old intern who ditched school and came in and was an intern for Tom Noonan. And together they changed the 3 top 100s, combined them into what was called the Hot 100, which became the most famous chart in the history of our world. And back in the 60s and 70s, during the heyday of rock and roll and the 45, you could go into a record store in Switzerland, in Sydney, almost any place except Russia or China, in the world, and there would be a Hot 100 hanging from the wall.
Wow.
That's how big a deal the Hot 100 that Tom created was. And in those years when Tom was at Billboard magazine, he took the black charts, which were then called the race charts.
Really?
And he changed it to a name he came up with, rhythm and blues, R&B. He invented the name R&B.
Really?
And the black artists
Wait,
at
what year
that time,
was that he invented?
55 or 6.
Wow.
The black artists that he knew, because they were all coming in to see him, and the DJs that came in, said, no, the black artists liked the name race charts. And he met with a lot of them, and they did like the name race charts, but he didn't like it. He didn't think it sounded good, didn't sound right, and he changed it to R&B.
Wow.
The country charts were then called country and western. And the few people he talked to in Nashville didn't like the western part. So he changed it to country.
I actually remember when it was called country western. I mean, I was a baby, but...
Yeah, he renamed it to country. Top 100, there were always new records coming up so fast back then. During those days with Tom Jones and with Chad and Jeremy and the millions of Smokey Robinson records, and every week there were 15 great new records that were coming on the charts. That's why records back then, you can go all the way to 4 in the charts in the 60s. Number 4, or number 3, even number 1. And in 8 weeks, if you were Herman Servant, you'd be gone. Because there were 15 new records every week coming on the charts.
Right.
Nowadays, there's 4 or 5.
Right.
Back then, there were 15. There were so many incredible great records from all over the world and all over the pop domain.
Although I remember songs like Hey Jude and stuff that would like be number 1 for like...
There were a few exceptions, but even
forever.
But even Hey Jude
would
probably be 20 weeks. Whereas a Mariah Carey record 5 years ago, 6 years ago, a year ago, would be 39 weeks.
Wow.
Be on the chart forever.
Right.
Back then, there were too many great records and knocking people off.
Right.
So, yeah, some records change, Every now and then a record would be number 1 for 8 weeks, like Mac the Knife, but it wasn't often. There were just too many great records coming out. When you think about back then, the artists who never had a number 1, Chuck Berry never had a number 1.
Is that true?
Little Richard never had a number 1.
Really?
Bruce Springsteen never had a number 1. Bob Dylan never had a number 1. He had 2 number 2s. Never had number 1.
What were his 2 number 2s?
I don't remember exactly which ones they were, but my favorite
Blowing
one,
in the Wind, I'm thinking...
Well, Blown in the Wind, he never put out. That was his record he wrote for Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Well, it was on his album.
Yeah, but he
didn't single it. Okay.
It was never his big hit single.
Right, okay. Did he have single? I never had a Bob Dylan single. I only had albums.
Like a Rolling Stone was his first one, and that went to 2. That was his first one. I couldn't think of both of them. That went to 2. Mm-hmm. And Subterranean Homesick Blues.
Love that song.
Yeah.
Or Just Like a Woman.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, so there were, Johnny Cash never had number 1.
Wow.
When I said Chuck Berry never had number 1,
mm-hmm.
Chuck Berry never had number 1 until they had a stupid gimmick song.
My Ding-a-Ling.
That went to 1.
Of course.
Nothing else did.
Mm-hmm.
And there were other great artists that never had a number 1 record. Because Elvis would be in there half the year. The Beatles later on would be in there half the year.
Right.
If you take 7 artists, if I can remember who the 7 are, it's Elvis, Diana Ross and the Supremes, Stevie Wonder,
the Rolling Stones, no.
Rolling Stones,
Mm-hmm.
Bee Gees,
Mm-hmm.
and there's 2 more I'm not
Did
thinking
you say
of.
the Beatles already?
I think I already said the Beatles.
Okay.
But there were 7 artists
Mm-hmm.
who had 13% of all the number 1 records in those first 30 years.
Wow.
So it was tough for other artists.
Mm-hmm.
Even the Beach Boys only had about 5 or 4.
Really?
They didn't have, they peaked at 2 and 3 and 5 all the time.
Mm-hmm.
One of the biggest group America ever had. But
Mm-hmm.
still, it was tough to get into the number 1 slot,
Mm-hmm.
back then.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I bring that up, and Creedence Clearwater, 5 of their first 6 records that they had in America, in the world, peaked at 2. They were the record breakers for never making number 1.
Wow.
Peaked at 2. How would you like to go in that marketing meeting every week? Oh, we're not number 1 again, but still. And there were many record companies who hated having a number 2 or a number 11 record. At A&M, when we went to marketing meetings, for me or Charlie, they would say to you guys,
Because that's your failure if it's number 2 or 11?
You got a number 2 record, you can't get to number 1? You got a number 11 record, you can't at least make it top 10? That was the thing that we had to do. Mm-hmm. And so, yet I always say, you know what? I'll take a number 2 record every time.
Yeah.
Every time.
Not bad.
Right.
Yeah.
If you were the second best movie if you had directed the second best movie of the year every year, wouldn't you be a happy person?
Yeah, I would. Get to Stevie Wonder.
Okay, so Stevie Wonder.
Yeah.
All right, Stevie Wonder. Now again, I interviewed him when I was 19, he was 17,
right.
in a hotel room. But years and years later, he would never remember me. He might remember me because, when you lose sight,
your other senses are
heightened.
Yeah.
So maybe he would have remembered. I don't know. But okay, so. Tom Noonan, my friend at
mm-hmm.
Billboard, he goes to, he does Billboard till 1968.
Mm-hmm.
And then Columbia Records likes him so much they hire him to be the head of promotion, which he's never done promotion. Mm-hmm. And I love to give this statistic, if I may.
Yeah.
He gets to Columbia Records and he realizes, there's a guy named Mitch Miller there who had a TV show called Sing Along with Mitch.
I remember Sing Along with Mitch.
And Mitch Miller hated rock and roll. And this is now 1968. I
remember what he looked like. He was a really weird-looking dude.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was the head of A&R,
mm-hmm.
which meant he decided
Mitch Miller was?
He decided what artists got signed. Wow. And all they had back then was Johnny Cash and Barbra Streisand and...
Her sister sang in my living room yesterday.
Really?
Rosalind Kind.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple other of soft artists,
mm-hmm.
right? And so... They had no rock and roll. And it was the 12th year of rock and roll. We started in 56, now it's 68, mm-hmm. and they've got no rock and roll. Mm-hmm. And Columbia Records is dying. Mm-hmm. Tom gets there and realizes, I made a mistake. I came to a label where it's a rock and roll world, and we got no rock and roll. He didn't pay any attention before he got there. Mm-hmm. But Mitch Miller left the company, mm-hmm. and the record company president, after 30 years, retires, mm-hmm. and a new president becomes a guy who was a lawyer for Columbia at the time by the name of Clive Davis. He liked Tom. Mm-hmm. Kept Tom on as head of promotion, and Clive Davis and the A&R people he appointed in their first 2.5 years, and no record company ever, I defy anybody to tell me any record company that's ever signed artists like this in a 2.5 year period. Big Brother and the Holding Company, which of course became Janis Joplin. Mm-hmm. Bob Dylan, Billy Joe Royal, Blood, Sweat and Tears, the Buckinghams, the Byrds, the Chambers Brothers, Time Will Come Today, Chad and Jeremy with 5 hits, Chicago, which were first Chicago Transit Authority, then mm-hmm. Chicago, who's still together today, yes. and the second biggest group in America behind the Beach Boys.
Somebody I know is playing percussion for them right now.
There you go.
Mm-hmm.
Circle, you might not know them, but they had 2 hits. Gary Puckett and Union Gap. The Hardin Trio, which was country, but they had a couple of pop hits too.
Okay.
No, just one really. Mark Lindsay and Paul Revere and the Raiders. O.C. Smith, Little Green Apples. Paul Revere and the Raiders with 5 huge hits. Peaches and Herb, mm-hmm. United and all that stuff. Pozo Single Singers, which was country, but they had a couple of pop hits too. Santana and Simon and Garfunkel.
Jesus Christ!
Can you even believe that that's possible? No. So Tom's there for 2 years. What?
What taste?
Yeah. Tom's there for 2 years. Date Records says, you know what? We're giving you your own label. They give him a label, date, and he signs Peaches and Herb. Mm-hmm. And then he gets a call from a guy from Detroit who he's never been to Detroit in his life, a guy named Barry Gordy, who's pretty big already with Motown. Mm-hmm. Tom, we want you to come to Motown and be the head of marketing. Tom goes there. He is there for 3 days. He opens up his drawers in his office. There's nothing there except one check for Stevie Wonder for $1. A few days later, he meets Stevie Wonder and they become friends. A few days later, Barry Gordy comes in and says, Tom, tomorrow you need to rent a van. You need to go to Detroit Airport. You need to pick up these 5 kids. I know you're just getting started, and I hate to take you away from your business, but you got to go to Detroit Airport and pick up these 5 kids from Gary, Indiana, who Diana, meaning Diana Ross, wants me to sign. I've heard their records. I'm not going to sign them, but for Diana, who's our biggest artist we have,
and also his woman on the side.
I was trying to think, how do I say that?
Yeah, his woman on the side.
How do I say that?
Okay.
He wants to do this for Diana, but he only wants to bring them in. He doesn't want to sign them. So he tells Tom to go to the Detroit Airport in a van to pick up their equipment and everything, to pick up the group called the Jackson 5. Michael and his 4 brothers, and they're just on this little plane, first time they've ever been on an airplane, and they're at the airport shaking. Their equipment's 3 hours late, so Tom's got to sit with them in a little store and a little Coke place and drink some Cokes and try to get them to talk. None of them would talk. They're still scared from the flight. Their equipment's 3 hours late. They finally get it. They put them in the van. They go to the boathouse, they called it, for Barry Gordy. He listened to them do 3 songs and totally changed his mind. Not because of Diana. Fell in love with them, signed them. The rest was history with the Jackson 5. So a few days later, Tom is in his office and Barry Gordy comes in and says, how's everything going? You know, you're still new, and thanks so much for what you did 2 days ago, and that was really something. You know, I'll never forget that you were the guy that got him to talk and open up and all that. And he said, Tom, how's it going with Stevie Wonder, his new project? And he said, well, pretty good. I've met with Stevie a few times, and I like his new album. And I told Stevie that Stevie wanted to go into the marketing meeting on next Thursday and tell your creative guy, your album cover guy, your salesperson, your marketing, the 12 people in the meeting, head of promotion, head of publicity, tell each of them what he's expecting that from the album. And Barry said, oh, no, you misunderstand. No artist, not David Ruffin, not even Diana, not Martha and the Vandellas, no artist ever goes into the marketing meeting. That's not for the artists. They don't ever go in, so Stevie can't go. Smokey goes because he's head of A&R, but nobody else can go in. He goes, oh my God. And then Barry changes his mind and says, you know what? You did such a great job with the Jackson 5. You can bring him into the meeting, but do not tell any other artists ever, and you tell Stevie this is a secret to keep for all time, because we can't open the doors. You know. Okay, now, Tom had told me about this story, but what he didn't tell me was, I meet Stevie Wonder a couple years ago at a funeral for a former president of Motown. And in this meeting, this funeral, there's 1,200 people there, including all these major artists. Lionel Richie's about to do the eulogy. And I got Smokey Robinson 2 seats away from me, and I'd met him once or twice. And there's Stevie Wonder sitting in the front row next to me, in front of me. And I only met him that one time I did the interview, so I didn't know him at all. Didn't think he'd ever remember me. And so the 2 priests at this funeral say, okay, before we talk about other things, for the next 3 minutes, we're not going to talk at all. It was very religious. I want everybody here to meet somebody, say hello to somebody in your row that you don't know and make a new friend for 3 minutes. And then we'll get back to business. So I go, Smokey Robinson, Stevie Wonder, flip a coin. I walk over to Stevie Wonder. Now, before I tell you, I got to tell you this one little story. I did meet him one other time, but I didn't get to talk to him really. Tom Noonan had a UCLA extension class for 12 years, throughout the 80s and early 90s. And he was supposed to have 35 people sign up to his class about how to get into the music business. Every year he had over 130 people sign up, and they let him have it in one of these big showroom, whatever those big stadium rooms are at UCLA, and he'd have all these people. and they had 130 people. And so every year he'd have one person from a radio station for the 10 weeks come and speak, a marketing person, a promotion person.
We've been talking for over 2 hours.
I know.
Okay.
I know.
Okay.
Are we okay on time? Okay. I won't make my showcase. That's okay.
No. Well, but all right.
Do we have to close up?
Soon. Finish,
Okay.
but tell us the story.
I'll finish in 2 minutes.
Okay.
Okay. So Tom at this UCLA class every week has somebody. The 8th week he would bring everybody over to A&M, where I would give a full tour of all these 130 people to the A&M soundstage, which used to be Charlie Chaplin Studios. In the 9th week, he'd have a manager of a major group, and in the 10th week, he'd have an artist. And over those 12 years, one time he had Rod Stewart, one time he had Barry Gibb, one time he had Rod Stewart. I said Rod Stewart. He had Bob Seger. He was a big deal, and he'd get these people to come.
Wow.
He had Madonna come one time, you know.
Wow.
But he never told the students who it would be. He would surprise them. So he's in an airport at LAX, and he's in one of those American Airlines 3-story escalators, and he's at the top, and Tom never realized that you don't just shout out when you think of something. And he saw way at the bottom, with 80 people in the middle, Stevie Wonder. He hadn't seen him in 10 years. And Tom just, Stevie! Yells out with all these people, you know. And Stevie goes, Tom Noonan, is that you, Tom Noonan? He remembered him after he hadn't seen him in 10 years.
Wow.
They talked for 10 minutes, and then Stevie says, what time is it to his manager? We got to catch our plane. Tom, let me hug you, and let me tell you that of all the representatives at record labels I ever met, there was no one that could hold a candle to you. What you did for my career, and just knowing you, you were the best marketing person I ever knew.
Wow.
And he hugged him. And he said, if there's anything I can ever do for you. So Tom said, well, I teach a class at UCLA, and if you're in town in 2 weeks, you could speak at my class at UCLA. But only if you're in town. I know you have homes in LA and Detroit. If you're in Detroit, it's not worth it. I'll get somebody. He said, no, I'm there. To make a long story short, he wound up being in Detroit, flying in with his 7 band members from Detroit, all paid for, first class, with all the equipment.
Stevie paid.
Stevie paid for everything, without telling Tom. The manager called me, and I just set it up with UCLA to where we would fake it, like he wasn't going to make it, at the last minute. Instead, they put all this equipment in this room next to him where they had a curtain, so they could fake it. And so I was the guy that had to go out and see if the limo was there, you know, but I knew what was going to happen. And so every time I came back, Tom goes, Tom only spoke to the class for the first hour. Yeah, is he coming? No, doesn't look good. So Tom was really mad, because he could have got somebody else.
Right.
And so then, all of a sudden, the UCLA guy came in, and they set up the fire alarm in that classroom. Tom said, what's going on? The UCLA guy says, it's a fire drill, but you don't have to go outside. Everybody goes to the next room.
Such a great story.
So they go to the next room. You know, Tom's really mad about everything.
Yeah.
That and that. So Tom starts speaking to the class again, knowing that Stevie's not going to make it.
Yeah.
And then the UCLA guy lowers the lights before he opens the curtains. And so Tom said, now what? Now what's wrong? And the lights go down, the curtains open, and there's Stevie Wonder with his 8-piece band, and they do an hour of his greatest hits.
It gives me chills.
Right. Okay, so now, back to the funeral. I go over and talk to Stevie Wonder, and I said, Stevie, my name is also Steve Resnik, how you doing? I didn't tell him I interviewed him once. He might have remembered, but I only had 3 minutes. So I just wanted to say hi, and I just wanted to tell you that our good friend Tom Noonan went to his grave last year with a smile on his face because of what you did for him at UCLA. And by the way, 7 to 8 was Tom talking. 8 to 10 was the class, 2 hours, with the artist or whoever spoke that week. He stayed till 1 in the morning, Stevie, and spoke to every person. Okay? So I said, what you did for Tom Noonan put a smile on Tom's grave when he passed away last year. And Stevie started crying, and he hugged me. And he's a big guy, and he hugged me really hard. And he said, Tom Noonan was the greatest guy that ever lived in the record business. He said, do you know what he did for me when he got to Motown? And I said, well, going into the marketing meeting? Because I knew about that, but I didn't know the details. He said, do you know the details of what he did? I said, no. He said, he told me the same story that I already knew. And he said, the night before, we were supposed to go in the meeting at 10 o'clock in the morning on Thursday. Tom went out to Macy's and bought 15 cologne. Different bottles of cologne, different type, different companies. And that morning, he put a label on every jar, whatever you call that, tube, and he gave it to each person in that room. This is Barry Gordy, and he sprayed it. So before he did that, before he gave them each a bottle, he says, Stevie, that'll be Barry Gordy. take a different bottle. That'll be the marketing person. That'll be Stevie Wonder. That'll be the girl that does publicity. And then he gave the bottle to her, put on a lot of cologne. I go, what? Put on, your name's on there, put a lot of cologne on, and then go in the meeting. And none of them knew even Stevie was coming. So a few minutes later, he waited until 10 minutes after everybody was in there, Tom walked Stevie in there, and Tom walked around the room. So Joe, my album cover, you walk up to all these people by smelling them.
Oh my God.
As if you could see.
Oh my God.
Penny, tell me what you're going to do with my album cover. Sam, how about the marketing and all the one-stops? How are we going to get records in there? And Barry, what do you think we should tell the publicity? He knew everybody by their smell.
Wow.
As if he could see.
Wow.
And Stevie Wonder told me that story.
Wow.
Anyway, so to end the whole story, I said, Stevie, I've told you about my museum. I've got this rock and roll museum. Tom gave me something of yours. The first day he got there, he never showed you, there was a check there for $1 in his drawer. He said, what do you mean? Yeah, and he gave it to me for my museum. He should have given it to you, but he gave it to me. And I said, one of the stupider things I've ever said in my entire life. I could have killed myself, but once I started saying it, it was almost as bad as when I interviewed Led Zeppelin. I knew I was making a mistake. I said, I didn't know how to end the conversation.
Yeah.
And I knew the 3 minutes was about over.
Right.
So I said, Stevie, I know you haven't made an album now in about 12 years. And I just want you to know, if times are tough, I want you to call me.
I've got a check for you.
I will FedEx this check over to you for $1. And I said, this is the stupidest thing I've ever done and said in my life. He turned around thinking it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. He had 8 bodyguards there. Listen to this, guys. Listen to this, guys. He told him the story. That's how I ended. But that's my Stevie Wonder story.
Steve, your stories are fantastic. You are amazing. You are an encyclopedia of rock and roll. Has anybody said a suggestion of a single? Pete?
They did, but I don't know if it'll work because we're going to have to unplug the mic and remember what happened the last 2 times.
Why don't we do a part 2 next time when we...
Okay, so you know what?
Yeah.
So
and I still might try to hit the showcase.
Yeah, go hit your showcase. So I don't know if it's going to work. So we'll do a part 2 and we'll find a way to have like a remote internet come with us.
You can get an extender kind of thing.
Yeah, we can get like a thing.
We'll get a thing.
We'll get a thing.
We'll get a thing. Steve, thank you so much for doing this. You're such a delight. I love your stories. Pete, thanks so much. We didn't get to talk to you much tonight. I'm sorry.
It's all good.
But for all
You'll
of
be
you...
doing part 2 as well.
I will. And Uncle Don George from Cleveland was watching tonight.
Perfect.
Oh, sweet.
And I want to say hi to my future wife. I didn't mention her name, Oni. I love my girlfriend, Oni, who's in the next room right now, but I want to mention her name.
Beautiful.
That's very sweet.
Yeah.
I want to thank you all for tuning in, and we'll be back next week. Alvino Bennett. Okay, Alvino's plays drums with Dave Mason forever.
Right.
And so Alvino will be in the living room next week, and we'll be pre-celebrating the 4th of July. Have a wonderful week. We'll see you next time. Thank you.